Please don't touch me, she whispered. And when the silk shawl slipped from Adriana Vale's shoulders on her wedding night, Luca Moretti went completely still. Not from desire, from fury. The bruises covering her arms weren't fresh. They told a story that had been going on for years. Someone had been hurting this woman long before she ever became his wife. And whoever that someone was, they had just made the worst mistake of their lives. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Adriana's journey all the way to the end. Leave a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wedding cost $400,000. Adriana Vale knew this because her father had told her 3 separate times over the past month, each time with a different expression, pride, the first time warning the second, and something that looked almost like an apology, the third. Almost. Her father had never quite managed a real apology in his life, and this occasion wasn't going to be the one that broke his streak. The dress alone had taken 6 fittings, and a seamstress flown in from Milan. The flowers had been shipped overnight from a grower in the Netherlands. The venue, St. Catherine's Cathedral on Michigan Avenue, had been booked 14 months in advance. Its stone columns wrapped in white silk and cascading roses. Its pews filled with 300 guests, who represented the most powerful names in Chicago's overlapping worlds of business, politics, and organized crime. 300 people watching her walk down the aisle. 300 people seeing exactly what she wanted them to see. A composed, beautiful young woman in an ivory gown carrying white peonies. Her dark hair swept up beneath a cathedral veil, her chin lifted just enough to suggest serenity. Not one of them saw her hands. She had thought about that carefully. The bouquet was large. The stems wrapped in silk ribbon wound around her palms just so, covering the places where her fingers were pressing so hard into the flowers that she could feel the stems bruising. She held that bouquet like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Because it was. Luca Moretti was standing at the altar. She had seen photographs of him before. Of course she had. Everyone in Chicago had seen photographs of Luca Moretti because photographs of powerful men had a way of circulating. And Luca Moretti was the most powerful man in this city by nearly every measure that actually mattered. 40 photographs couldn't have prepared her for the reality of him, 6 feet 2 inches of absolute stillness. Dark suit, dark eyes watching her walk toward him with an expression she couldn't read and didn't know how to interpret and was absolutely terrified to try. He was not smiling. He wasn't frowning either. He was simply watching her with those coal-black eyes. His jaw set, his hands clasped in front of him completely at ease, in the way that only men who had never once been afraid in their adult lives could manage. Men who had made other men afraid instead. She counted her steps. 1, 2, 3, 4. She had learned to count when she was 17 years old, during the first time she had needed to get through something by convincing her body it was doing something other than what it was actually doing. The counting helped. It gave her mind somewhere to go that wasn't where she was. Her father walked beside her, his hand resting on her arm with a grip that felt more like ownership than comfort. He had dressed carefully tonight. Of course he had. Victor Vale had always understood the theater of important occasions. 23 steps from the door to the altar. Adriana counted every one. When she reached Luca Moretti, and her father placed her hand in his, she kept her eyes on the collar of his white shirt, not his face. His collar was safe. His collar didn't have eyes that could see through things. His hand closed around hers. She stopped breathing. "Breathe," he said very quietly. Not a whisper exactly, but something lower than his speaking voice, meant only for her. She looked up, involuntarily startled out of the careful nowhere she'd been staring at, and found him watching her with an expression she still couldn't read. But his grip on her hand wasn't crushing. It was just firm. Like he was trying to tell her something through his palm. She didn't know what. She breathed. The ceremony lasted 47 minutes. She knew because she counted those too. The reception was worse. Not because anything terrible happened. Nothing terrible happened. The dinner was served. The speeches were made. The toasts were raised. Her father gave a speech about legacy and partnerships and the future of great families. And she watched the way his eyes went to Sebastian Crow in the third row. And she watched the way Sebastian Crow smiled back, and she held her champagne glass carefully and did not allow her face to change. Sebastian Crow was 50 years old, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who filled whatever room he entered without seeming to try. He had the smile of a man who had never faced consequences for anything, which was the kind of smile that could look warm from across a room and terrifying from up close. He sat at the third table with his wife, his second wife 20 years younger, who touched her own jewelry too often and never quite made eye contact with other women in the room. He raised his glass when Adriana caught his eye. She looked away. "You're not drinking," Luca said beside her. "I am," she said, and took a small sip to demonstrate. "That glass has been full since they poured it." She set the glass down. "I don't like champagne." "Then they'll bring you something else." He made the smallest gesture with his hand, barely a movement, and a server appeared within 10 seconds. That was the thing about power she was realizing. It didn't announce itself. It just got things done. "Water?" she said. "Please." When the server left, Luca was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've been watching the clock." "I haven't." "The one above the bar. You've looked at it 11 times. Adriana turned and looked at him directly for the first time all evening. He looked back at her without any particular expression. Just watching. Just noting. "I'm tired," she said. "Then we'll leave." It wasn't a question. He stood, offered her his hand, palm up, not grasping, and waited. She looked at that hand for a moment. Then she placed hers on top of it and stood, and he walked her out of her own wedding reception, while 300 guests watched, and not one of them said a word, because 300 guests had the wisdom to understand that when Luca Moretti decided an evening was over, the evening was over. In the car, they didn't speak. She watched the lights of Michigan Avenue passing the window, and thought about the next 8 hours, and told herself to keep breathing. Just keep breathing. That was the only task. She had gotten through things before by reducing them to their smallest possible pieces, and the smallest possible piece of tonight was just air. Just the next breath. They arrived at the house she had only seen it once before during the brief formal meeting where the terms of their arrangement had been discussed in language that carefully avoided calling it what it was, and she followed him inside. The foyer was marble and dark wood, high-ceilinged and quiet. 2 men were stationed near the entrance, who acknowledged Luca with small nods, and didn't look at her at all. She stood in the foyer still in her wedding dress, her bouquet long since abandoned at the reception, her veil removed in the car, and she watched Luca speak quietly to one of his men and thought about the layout of the house. Exits. Stairways. The location of the room she'd been shown on her brief tour, which had its own lock. Whether the lock worked from the inside. Luca dismissed his men and turned to her. "Are you hungry?" She blinked. "What?" "The reception dinner you didn't eat much." She hadn't realized he'd been watching that closely. "I'm fine. The kitchen is fully stocked. There's someone on staff until midnight if you need anything." He loosened the top button of his collar, utterly at ease, as if this were any other evening. "I'll have someone show you your room." She absorbed that. "Your room." "My room," she repeated. "You didn't think I was going to—" He stopped, read something in her face. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "No. You have your own room, your own bathroom, your own sitting area. The door locks from the inside." A pause. "I should have been clearer about that before tonight. That was my mistake." Adriana stared at him. In 10 years of navigating situations that required very careful reading of men who held power over her, she had developed an almost clinical ability to detect performance. Men said things to seem kind. They said things to get what they wanted while maintaining the appearance of generosity. They said things in the early days, and then the things stopped when the doors closed. She had no idea what to make of this. "Thank you," she said, because that was the safe response. He nodded. "A woman named Elena will take you up. She handles the household staff. If you need anything tonight, you tell her." "All right," Adriana. She had already started toward the hallway where Elena had appeared in the doorway. She turned back. "You're safe here," Luca said. He said it simply, no performance in it, no particular weight intended to impress her. Just a statement flat and certain the way he might have stated any other fact about his household. She turned back around before he could see what that did to her face. She couldn't sleep. This was not unusual. She hadn't slept through a full night in longer than she could accurately remember. Sleep required a level of unconsciousness that she had never quite been able to trust, because unconsciousness meant not knowing what was happening around her, and not knowing had always been more dangerous than exhaustion. The room was beautiful. She noticed that in the way she noticed most things that were beautiful at a slight remove, the way you admire a painting in a gallery, appreciating the craft without feeling it had anything to do with you. The bed was dressed in cream linen. The windows looked out onto the lake, and the city lights touched the water in a way that was probably considered romantic by people who were capable of experiencing romance. She changed out of her wedding dress. This was the part she had been dreading all evening. The mechanics of the dress, which required either another person or a significant amount of contortion. She managed it herself, slowly turning and unhooking and stepping out of it with the focused care of a woman who had learned not to ask for help with anything she could possibly do alone. She folded it over the back of a chair. She stood in her slip, and the room was quiet, and she finally allowed herself to feel how tired she was. The bone-deep exhaustion of a performance sustained for nearly 12 hours. Every muscle in her face and neck and shoulders remembering what it was like to carry itself correctly in front of witnesses. She reached for the silk robe she'd packed and crossed to the window to check the latch. The door opened. She spun and the robe slipped from her hands. She'd only been holding it loosely, not yet wearing it, and she stood there in her slip, both arms wrapping around herself instinctively, and Luca Moretti was in the doorway. He stopped the moment he saw her. "The window latch on the east side sticks," he said, and his voice was completely level, but his eyes had gone somewhere else, somewhere sharp and very still. "Elena was supposed to tell you." He stopped again. He was looking at her arms. She knew what he was seeing. The left forearm, where the bruise had gone from purple to that sickly yellow-green at the edges, still purple and dark at the center, roughly the size of a hand. The right shoulder, where a different bruise, older, yellower, softer at the edges, climbed from the strap of her slip toward her collarbone. The ones she couldn't see herself, but knew were there from the particular way certain movements still made her breath catch. She reached for the robe where it had fallen. "Adriana?" "It's fine." She pulled the robe on and belted it. Her hands were steady. She had a great deal of practice with steady hands. "I bruise easily." "Those bruises aren't from a fall." "You don't know that." "I've seen bruises from falls." His voice was very quiet. "I've also seen bruises that aren't." She tightened the belt of the robe, turned toward the window away from him because it was easier. "You should knock." "You're right, I should have. I'm sorry." He didn't leave. She could hear that he hadn't left. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to understand that however you answer, nothing changes. Your room is yours. Your safety in this house is guaranteed regardless. I'm not asking because the answer affects what happens next." She was quiet. "Who did that to you?" She had been asked this question before. By a nurse once at a clinic she had gone to after a particularly bad encounter, claiming she'd fallen downstairs, who had looked at her with that particular expression of professionally restrained knowing and asked the same question. By a friend from college who had noticed something once years ago and pushed gently. By herself in mirrors in the early mornings, before she had fully assembled herself, asking in a way that was really asking something different. "Why did you let it happen? What is wrong with you? Why can't you?" "No one," she said. "Adriana. No one." She kept her voice even, smooth. She was very good at smooth. "I told you, I bruise easily. It's a medical thing. My iron levels—" "Stop." She stopped. Not because he raised his voice. He hadn't raised his voice. He stopped her with the quietness of it actually, with the particular quality of a quiet that wasn't passive, but was instead the kind that could hold a great deal of weight without spilling any of it. She heard him move not toward her. She registered that immediately, the relief of it, but to the chair beside the window where he sat. She turned slightly and looked at him, and he was sitting with his elbows on his knees, his hands loosely clasped, looking at the floor. "I had a sister," he said. She hadn't expected that. She was 22. I was 29. I was already deep into everything I'm in now, and I thought I understood what danger looked like, and I thought I understood what I needed to protect her from. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't understand what was right in front of me, because the person who was hurting her looked like someone who had never hurt anyone. He looked like a good man. He had everyone convinced he was a good man. Adriana turned all the way to face him now. "By the time I understood what had been happening," Luca said, "it was too late to stop it. And I have spent 9 years understanding that the decision I made to trust appearances to believe the surface of things cost my sister something she never fully got back." The room was very still. "I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me," he said. "I'm telling you because I want you to know that I am not going to perform not seeing. I see it, and I'm not going to pretend I don't." Adriana's throat felt tight. She sat down on the edge of the bed because her legs had made that decision without consulting her. She sat, and she looked at this man who was supposed to be the most dangerous person she had ever encountered, and she tried to find the performance in what he'd said, and she couldn't locate it. "It's not a medical thing," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "I know. It's been—" She stopped, started again. "It's not something that just started. It's been a long time." "How long?" She looked at her hands in her lap. 10 years roughly." The silence that followed was the longest yet. "And the person who did this," Luca said carefully deliberately, "is someone who was at our wedding tonight." It wasn't a question. She understood in the way she understood most things about perceptive and dangerous men that he had already worked a significant portion of this out on his own. She didn't answer, which was itself an answer. Luca stood. He moved to the door, and she looked up, and his face was entirely unreadable in the way that was different from before. Before it had been neutral. But now the neutrality was doing a great deal of work containing something that needed containing. "Get some sleep," he said. "And, Adriana—" He paused with his hand on the doorframe. "Whatever this has been, whatever you've been carrying, it's over now. You don't have to take my word for that tonight, but I'm going to spend however long it takes proving it to you." He left. The door closed. She sat on the edge of the bed in her borrowed robe in his house and listened to the city outside, and something very small and very old and very carefully buried tried to move in her chest. She pressed it back down. She couldn't afford it yet. But she noticed that she was breathing differently than she had been 2 hours ago. Morning came with winter light through the lake-facing windows and the smell of coffee from somewhere below, and Adriana sat up in the cream linen bed and spent 30 seconds confirming where she was before she got up and dressed. She found Elena in the kitchen, a woman in her 60s, silver-haired with the manner of someone who had seen everything and made peace with most of it, and accepted coffee and toast and the careful courtesy of someone who asked no questions. Luca was not in the house. "He leaves early," Elena told her, "before 6 most days. He said to tell you that someone will take you wherever you need to go, whenever you want to go." Adriana wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. "He said that. He also said you'd probably not believe it." Elena set a small dish of jam on the table with the serenity of someone delivering information without editorializing. "He said you should test it. She did a little that morning. She asked to go to a shop in Lincoln Park, and a car appeared within 15 minutes. A driver who opened the door and said nothing about where she went, or how long she stayed, or what she bought. She spent an hour in the shop, a small gallery, actually, not a store. She'd said shop because the other word felt too private, and no one followed her inside. And when she came back out, the car was waiting, and the driver still asked no questions. She sat in the back seat on the way home, and felt for the first time in a very long time the particular sensation of having been somewhere by choice. It was dizzying, like standing up too fast. She had forgotten it was supposed to feel like something. Oh, Sebastian Crow called her cell phone at 11:15. She was back at the house by then in the sitting room adjacent to her bedroom with a book she wasn't reading when the phone vibrated and his name appeared on the screen and her entire body registered it, the way a body registers sudden cold. Not a thought exactly, but a physical fact. A tightening, a narrowing. She stared at his name for 4 rings. Then she answered. "You looked well last night," he said. His voice was warm. It was always warm. That had been the most confusing part in the beginning when she was 15, and he was her father's closest associate, and she had thought warmth meant something. "The dress was stunning. Your father chose wisely." "Thank you," she said. Her voice was perfectly steady. Decades of practice. "I wanted to check in. The transition to a new household can be disorienting." A pause with something underneath it. "I imagine Moretti is quite different from what you're accustomed to." "He's been very gracious." "Good, good." Another pause, this one longer. "I hope you're remembering, Adriana, that this arrangement, while it changes certain things, doesn't change our understanding." There it was. Our understanding. That was what he called it. Their understanding. As if there were 2 parties who had reached it together. "I understand," she said. "I thought you might. You've always been sensible about these things." His voice dropped the register that he used when he wanted to remind her of something, without saying it directly. "I'll be in touch. Enjoy your honeymoon period." The line went dead. She set the phone face down on the cushion beside her and sat very still, and looked at the wall across the room, and thought about the fact that she had for the past 11 hours been foolish enough to feel something approaching relief. She had forgotten. Or not forgotten, she never actually forgot, but allowed herself briefly the dangerous luxury of imagining that geography could change something that geography had nothing to do with. Sebastian Crow didn't care that she was married. Sebastian Crow didn't care that there were 3 inches of oak door between her and anyone else in this house. Sebastian Crow had reached her when she was in a locked room before. She picked up the phone again and sat for a long time, and then for reasons she didn't fully examine. She opened the house contact list that Elena had sent her that morning, a simple list, names and numbers, everyone on staff, and scrolled until she found Luca Moretti's personal cell. She didn't call it, but she didn't close the app either. She sat with the number on the screen and reminded herself that this was just a different kind of trap, and she had been foolish enough before to think that help was being offered when it was really just being dangled, and she was not going to make that mistake again. She told herself that with great conviction, and she almost believed it. Luca came home at 6:40. She knew because she had not in fact been tracking the time. She had absolutely not been aware, the way she was always aware of time in any household she lived in, of how long the house had been quiet, and when the quality of that quiet was likely to change. She was in the dining room when she heard the front door, and she did not get up from her chair, and she maintained a perfectly normal expression while listening to the sounds of his arrival. The murmur of conversation with his men. Footsteps the direction of them. He appeared in the dining room doorway. "You stayed in all day," he said. Not an accusation, just noting. "I went out this morning. Lincoln Park." He came in and sat down across from her, not beside her, across with the full width of the table between them. "Elena told me." "Does Elena report to you about my movements?" "Elena told me because I asked this morning to be informed that you'd gone and returned safely." He met her eyes steadily. "Not where. Not what you did. Just that you came back. That's the only part I needed to know." She studied him. "Why? Because this is a new situation, and until you know how safe it is, I needed to know you weren't having to find that out the hard way." He picked up the glass of water Elena had set at his place and drank unhurried. "Did someone call you today?" Her chest tightened. "What?" "Your expression was different when I came in than it was yesterday morning." He set the glass down. Something shifted. "I want to know what." This was the thing she hadn't anticipated about him. She had prepared for anger for demands for the various ways powerful men expressed ownership. She had not prepared for this for being noticed, for someone looking at her face and seeing it as a thing that communicated. "It was nothing," she said. "Adriana." It was a phone call. She kept her voice level. An old family associate, checking in. "Which associate?" "It doesn't—" "Which associate?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Sebastian Crow." The change in Luca's expression was subtle. If she hadn't been watching closely, and she was always watching closely, she might have missed it. A very slight settling of his jaw. A small shift in the quality of his attention from general to focused. What did he say? That he hoped I was settling in well. A pause. And that our arrangement hadn't changed. What arrangement? His word for it. She looked down at the table. "We have a long history. Sebastian and my family. He's been present for most of my life." "Present how?" She looked up. In 10 years, she had been asked versions of this question by exactly 3 people, and each of those 3 people had taken her answer and done something with it that had ultimately made things worse. A friend who'd told another friend who'd told the wrong person. A nurse who'd filed a report that got back to her father. A therapist she'd seen for 6 weeks at 21, whose notes had somehow she'd never been certain how ended up where they'd ended up. 3 times of trying to answer. 3 times of the answer becoming a weapon pointed back at her. She had stopped answering the question after that. "He's someone who—" She chose words carefully. "He has influenced my life significantly, over a long period of time." Luca was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's the one who hurt you." She said nothing. "You don't have to confirm it," Luca said. "I'm telling you what I already know." "You don't know anything. I know what I saw last night." His voice remained even, but she could hear something working underneath it, something that was choosing very carefully not to arrive at the surface yet. "I know what 10 years of bruises looks like on someone who has learned to carry them like they're normal. And I know that a man like Sebastian Crow, who has been inside your family's life for that long, a man with that kind of access and that kind of social armor—" He stopped. "He called you the morning after your wedding. Many people called. He called you specifically, on your personal phone, to tell you that your marriage didn't change anything." She said nothing. The silence stretched between them, and in it, something shifted. She could feel it, the particular sensation of a thing that had been in darkness beginning to be seen. The terrifying and disorienting feeling of that. "Adriana." His voice was different now, still quiet. But underneath the quiet was something she could only describe as deliberate. Intentional, the way the foundation of a building is intentional, not visible, but the reason everything else stands up. "I need to understand something, and I'm going to ask you directly, because I think you've had enough of people talking around things." He looked at her steadily. "Has Sebastian Crow been abusing you?" The word landed in the room like something physical. She had never heard it spoken aloud in reference to herself. She had thought it. In the long, early mornings and the longer nights, she had turned it over, examined it, tried on various versions of it, tried to argue against it, tried to find the version of events where it didn't apply. She had read about it in books and articles and recognized pieces of herself in descriptions, and then carefully set those recognitions aside, because naming it made it real, and making it real made it something that required action, and action required a belief that action was possible, and believing that had been for a very long time the most dangerous thing she could have done to herself. Naming it made it something that couldn't be quietly survived. She started. Her voice stopped. "Take your time," Luca said. She looked at the table. At the grain of the wood dark walnut, the faint irregularities in it where the pattern moved in small waves. She looked at it for a long time. "Yes," she said. The word came out smaller than a whisper, but it came out. The quiet that followed it was enormous. "For how long?" Luca said. 10 years. Her voice was steadier now that the first word was out. There was something strange about that. She'd expected the opposite, had expected to feel more fragile once she'd said it, but instead the second sentence came more easily. The first time I was 15. He was everyone thought he was. She stopped. He was respected. He's always been respected. He's the kind of man who everyone looks at him and sees a certain kind of man. I know the kind. My father. She pressed her hands flat on the table. When I told my father at 17, he told me I had misunderstood the situation. A pause. He didn't say I was lying. He said I had misunderstood. What did your mother say? My mother died when I was 12. Luca was quiet. Sebastian has been very careful, Adriana said. There's nothing on paper, nothing documented. He's built his whole life very deliberately, so that there's nothing. She looked up. And he's very aware of what I could and couldn't prove. He's reminded me of that regularly. He's threatened you. He's informed me of realities. She heard how that sounded. That's what he calls it, informing me of realities. And your family. My family has financial relationships with him that they consider non-negotiable. She said it simply because the simplicity of it was the most honest thing about it. He has made it clear that those relationships are contingent on my cooperation. He's been using access to your family to control you. Yes. For 10 years. Yes. Luca stood up from the table. She watched him. Couldn't help it, tracking the movement the way she always tracked movement, calculating distance and direction and intent, the automatic response of a body that had learned to treat all motion as potentially relevant to its own safety. But he didn't come toward her. He moved to the window, stood with his back to her for a long moment, his hands at his sides perfectly still. And she had the sense that the stillness was effortful, that something under the stillness needed very much to not be still. The people he said he'd expose or hurt. Luca said, his back still to her, if you talked. Yes. Who? She told him. 3 people, 2 of whom she genuinely loved, 1 of whom she felt responsible for, even though she knew rationally that the responsibility wasn't hers. She told him in the same level voice she'd been using because the voice was the only thing she controlled fully, and she was going to hold on to it. When she was done, Luca turned around. Those people will be protected, he said. Starting tonight. She stared at him. It's a practical matter, he said. If Crow decides to use them as leverage at any point, I need to have removed that possibility in advance. You can do that. Yes. Just like that. It's not just like that, he said. It will take several phone calls and a reallocation of resources, and I'll be on the phone until midnight. But yes. He held her gaze. I can do that. She was quiet for a very long moment. Why? She said. Why what? Why would you do this? She looked at him steadily because she needed to watch his face when he answered. We've known each other for less than a day. This doesn't benefit you. You're a man who operates on benefit. That's how your world works. My world has more than one principle in it. Luca. He looked at her, and something in his expression shifted, became slightly less managed, slightly more present. Because it's the right thing, he said simply. Because I can. Because there is a man in this city who has been hurting a woman for 10 years and calling it a reality she needed to accept, and that is... His jaw tightened. That is not something I am capable of being aware of and doing nothing about. You'll make an enemy of Sebastian Crow. Sebastian Crow was already my enemy. He just hadn't figured that out yet. Adriana looked at this man, this dangerous, careful, controlled man sitting across from her in his expensive house on the night after a wedding that had been arranged on paper as a transaction, and felt something she hadn't felt in so long that it took her a moment to identify it. Not hope exactly. Something more fragile than hope. Something that came before hope, like the first green thing that pushes through ice when it's still technically winter. She stopped, tried again. I don't know how to trust this. I know. I've been through... She stopped again. I'm very good at recognizing when something is going to be taken away. I know that too. He held her gaze steadily. I'm not asking you to trust it tonight. I'm telling you what's true, and I'm going to make phone calls, and tomorrow you'll see the results, and we'll go from there. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. One small, careful nod. It wasn't trust. It wasn't even close to trust. But it was the first thing she had offered in 10 years that wasn't constructed specifically to protect herself from the person she was offering it to. And sitting in the walnut-paneled dining room of the most dangerous man in Chicago, at the end of the strangest and most exhausting day of her life, Adriana Vale decided to let that be enough. For tonight. Just for tonight. Luca picked up his phone. I'll make the calls, he said, and she sat at his table in the blue dark of the winter evening and listened to his voice in the other room. And for the first time in a very long time, the sound of a man on a phone in the next room made her feel safer instead of less. She pressed her hands flat on the walnut table and breathed, in, out, and allowed herself very carefully to begin. He was on the phone until 12:47 in the morning. She knew because she hadn't slept, and she had heard him, not the words, just the low, steady current of his voice moving through the walls of the house, the particular cadence of a man who spoke to other men as someone accustomed to being listened to. No raised voice. No repetition. He said things once, and they happened. She had understood that about him at the reception, watching him make a server appear with a half gesture. But understanding it intellectually, and lying in a strange bed in the dark listening to it, were two different experiences. She lay on top of the covers in her robe and stared at the ceiling and cataloged what she knew. He had made calls on her behalf. 3 people, the ones she'd named, would have protection arranged by morning. She had no way to verify this yet. That was the part she kept returning to, because the part she couldn't verify was the part her experience had trained her to distrust most. Promises made in quiet rooms at night had a history of dissolving by daylight in her life. She had learned to measure people not by what they said in private, but by what existed in the morning. So she waited. At 1:15, the house went quiet. At 2, she was still waiting. At 3, she finally slept, not because she trusted anything, but because her body simply stopped cooperating with her mind, which was the only way she ever slept anymore. She woke at 6:10 to pale winter light and the smell of coffee, and her first thought was the same first thought she'd had every morning for the past 3 years. A rapid automatic inventory of her situation, the location of exits, the sounds of the household, the particular texture of the air that told her whether the day was going to require more from her than usual. The house was quiet in the way of early morning, not tense, just early. She dressed and went downstairs. Elena was already in the kitchen, and beside Elena's usual composed efficiency was a second woman, younger, maybe 40, with dark hair pulled back and the specific alert quality of someone trained to be in a room without seeming to occupy it. She stood near the window with her hands loosely at her sides and watched Adriana come in with the particular attention of someone whose job it was to notice things. "Mrs. Moretti?" Elena said. "This is Carmen. She'll be accompanying you when you're outside the house." Adriana stopped. She looked at the woman named Carmen. Carmen looked back with the neutral expression of a professional. "Accompanying me," Adriana said. "For your security," Elena said. "Mr. Moretti arranged it last night." "I didn't ask for—" "No." Luca's voice came from the hallway, and he appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed, jacket on, coffee in hand, entirely alert in a way that suggested he had either slept very little or had the kind of constitution that didn't require it. "You didn't ask. I arranged it anyway because until certain situations are resolved, I'm not comfortable with you moving around this city without someone competent beside you." Adriana looked at him. "Carmen is the best I have," he said. "She's worked protective detail for 12 years. She carries, she's trained, and she's discreet." A pause. "She's also been instructed that her job is to make your day easier, not harder. If you tell her to wait outside, she waits outside. She doesn't report the content of your conversations or your whereabouts beyond confirming you're safe. That's her only obligation to me. And if I don't want her, then I'd like you to tell me why so I can address the specific concern. He looked at her steadily. I'm not trying to control your movements. I'm trying to make sure someone who has been threatening you for 10 years doesn't have easy access to you while we figure out what we're doing. Carmen, for her part, said nothing. She had the quality of someone who understood that this conversation had nothing to do with her and was waiting with professional patience for it to resolve. Adriana looked at her coffee mug, then at Carmen, then at Luca. Fine, she said. Luca nodded once and turned to go. You made the calls, Adriana said to his back. He paused. The people I mentioned last night. She kept her voice even. You said you'd make calls. I did. And, he turned halfway back. The two people you're close to have protection in place as of this morning. They won't know why. It'll look like routine security upgrades, a change in staffing. Nothing that alerts Crow to what's happening. He met her eyes. The third person, your cousin, you said he's in Seattle. I have someone there who will keep an eye on the situation. She absorbed this. You did that last night, she said. I told you I would. People tell me things. I know. He held her gaze with that particular steadiness that she was beginning to recognize as simply him. Just him. That's why I made the calls last night instead of this morning. He left. She sat down at the kitchen table with her coffee and thought about a man who understood that the difference between a promise made at midnight and proof existing at 6 in the morning was the difference between words and reality. She thought about that for a long time. Sebastian called again at 9:40. She was in the sitting room off her bedroom, Carmen stationed in the hallway outside, with a book she may or may not have been actually reading when the phone vibrated on the end table with his name on it. She looked at it for 2 rings. Then she answered it, because not answering Sebastian Crow's calls had its own particular set of consequences, and she was not yet ready to invite those. You sound rested, he said. I slept well. She hadn't. Good. The warmth in his voice was impeccable. This was what made him so effective, that the warmth never wavered. It never cracked or dropped, register the way anger trying to masquerade as warmth eventually did. His warmth was structural. It was built into the foundation of how he moved through the world, because without it, the whole architecture collapsed. I heard Luca Moretti made some phone calls last night. Her chest tightened. She kept her breathing even. I wouldn't know about his calls. No. A pause, gentle, patient. He arranged some security adjustments for a few people, mutual acquaintances of ours. Another pause. That's an interesting first night's project for a new husband. He knew. He'd found out within 8 hours. She had thought she had time. She had allowed herself to believe, for the 6 hours between Luca's calls and this phone call, that she had a margin. A little runway to figure out what was happening before Sebastian started reacting. 8 hours. That was how long the margin had been. Luca is cautious, she said carefully. He runs a complex operation. Security arrangements are, Adriana. His voice dropped the register. Not threatening. Never threatening in a way that would translate to a recorded line. Just the particular pitch of a man reminding a woman of something she already knew. I've known you since you were 15 years old. I know when you're performing. A pause. What did you tell him? Nothing. He arranged protection for 3 specific people in your life within hours of your wedding night. That's not coincidence, my dear. I don't control what my husband does. But you informed what he did. The warmth still there underneath the precision, like heat under a thin layer of ice. I'm going to give you the opportunity to correct this before it becomes complicated. Sebastian, tell him it was a misunderstanding. Tell him you were emotional from the wedding, from the transition, that you said something that wasn't accurate. He's a pragmatic man. He'll accept a simple explanation if you deliver it correctly. A pause. I've watched you deliver explanations for years. You're very good at it. She said nothing. Adriana. I'll speak to him, she said. Good girl. The line went dead. She sat with the phone in her hand and the room around her, and she thought about 8 hours and what it meant that he already knew. And she thought about the phrase, "good girl," in the voice of a man who had used it for 10 years as a leash. And she sat with all of that sitting inside her chest like something with weight. Then she stood up, opened the sitting room door, and looked at Carmen in the hallway. "I need to speak to Luca," she said. "How do I reach him during the day?" Carmen reached into her jacket pocket and produced a card with a number on it. Just a number, no name, no label. "That goes directly to him," she said. "He picks up. Always, when it comes from this house. Yes." Adriana looked at the card. Then she went back into the sitting room and called the number. He picked up on the second ring. "He already knows," she said without preamble because she was done with setup and preamble. "Sebastian called me this morning. He knew about the security arrangements you made last night. He knew within hours." A brief silence. "How?" "I don't know. He has people everywhere. He always has. That's been part of why—" She stopped. "He told me to tell you it was a misunderstanding, that I was emotional from the wedding." "Are you going to—" "No." The word came out without hesitation, which surprised her, slightly. Surprised her in the way that finding something intact surprises you when you expected to find it broken. "I called you to tell you he knows, because if he knows this quickly, it means his network inside your circles is closer than you might think." A pause. "That's useful information. He's going to escalate," she said. "When he realizes I'm not going to manage you the way he's asking, he's going to start. He has ways of—" She stopped because describing Sebastian's methods required going into territory she'd been in before and had promised herself she wouldn't revisit in a phone call while standing in a borrowed room. "He's patient, but he's also decisive. He'll make a move. When he does, I need to know immediately. Luca." She kept her voice level, but let the seriousness of it come through fully. "He's connected to your world in ways you may not have fully mapped. Some of the men you work with, some of the people who came to our wedding, they have relationships with Sebastian that predate their relationships with you." Another silence, this one longer. "Give me names," he said. "Whatever you remember from conversations you've overheard, things your father said, business meetings you were present for." She closed her eyes. 10 years of information she had absorbed and stored and never used, never been able to use because using it required trusting someone with it. She had been in rooms. She had been in the background of dinners and meetings and conversations where men talked because they considered her furniture, and furniture didn't remember things. "This will take more than a phone call," she said. "Tonight then, when I'm home." "All right, Adriana." His voice shifted, not softer exactly, but something in it changed texture. "You're doing the right thing." She almost said something honest in response to that, which would have been unusual and possibly inadvisable. But instead she just said, "I'll see you tonight," and ended the call. She sat down on the edge of the bed and put her hands in her lap and took a long breath. She had just actively moved against Sebastian Crow for the first time in 10 years. The terror of that was real and specific, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But underneath the terror was something else, a thread of something she hadn't felt in so long she had to think about what to call it. Agency. She had done something. She had made a choice and acted on it, and the action was already in motion and couldn't be taken back. She sat with that for a moment. Then she got up because sitting with things had never been her style for long and knocked on the hallway door. "Carmen," she said, "I want to go out." They went to a coffee shop in Wicker Park. Carmen sat at the next table and read her book. Actually read it. Apparently, Adriana watched her turn pages at a pace consistent with genuine reading, and Adriana sat with a double espresso and her own thoughts and the small but significant pleasure of being somewhere by choice. She had her notebook. She'd kept a notebook since college. Not a diary, she had never felt safe keeping a diary, but a working document, pages of observations and notes, in a handwriting small enough to be difficult to read quickly. It had started as a coping mechanism and become a habit, and the habit had become over years a kind of record she'd never specifically intended to keep. She opened it now to a blank page and began writing down everything she remembered. Names, dates, contexts. The dinner where she'd heard her father mention a particular arrangement with Sebastian and a specific member of Luca's network. The phone call she'd overheard at 20, standing in a hallway, outside a closed door between Sebastian and someone whose voice she'd only identified later. The reference made once, and never repeated, to a fund that moved money through 3 layers of corporate structure before it arrived where Sebastian wanted it. She wrote for an hour and a half without stopping. When she looked up, the notebook was half full. She looked at it, at the pages of small, careful handwriting. 10 years of paying attention because paying attention was the only tool available to her. She closed the notebook and put it in her bag and drank the rest of her espresso and thought about the fact that she had spent a decade accumulating something that in the right hands was a great deal more than just a record. It was a map. And last night, for the first time, she had someone with the resources to use one. She was back at the house by noon. Elena had lunch ready, simple, unasked for, just there the way Elena managed everything. She ate at the kitchen table with the notebook beside her and Carmen across the room eating her own lunch. And something about the ordinariness of it, the kitchen quiet, the food hot, the company undemanding, hit her somewhere unexpected, and she had to press her fingers briefly against the bridge of her nose and breathe. She was not going to cry in Luca Moretti's kitchen over lunch. She got through it. At 2 in the afternoon, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She answered it because Sebastian sometimes called from numbers she didn't recognize, and she needed to know which calls to expect. It wasn't Sebastian. Mrs. Moretti, a woman's voice, professional, efficient. My name is Rachel. I work with your husband's legal team. He asked me to reach out to you today. She sat up straighter. About what? He'd like you to meet with one of our attorneys this afternoon if you're available, regarding some documentation that may be useful in your current situation. A pause. He said you'd understand the context. She did understand it. She also understood that Luca, who had been at whatever he did during the day, had still been moving pieces on this board while she'd been in a coffee shop writing in her notebook. What time? She said. 3 o'clock if that works. There's an office on LaSalle Street. I'll text you the address. I'll be there. She ended the call and looked at Carmen. We have a 3 o'clock. Carmen closed her book. I know. I'll get the car. Yeah. The attorney's name was Marcus Webb, 50s, silver at the temples. The particular kind of professional composure that came from years of sitting across from people in complicated situations and treating every complicated situation as a soluble problem. He had a conference room that faced a courtyard, and he had a file folder on the table when she came in, and he stood when she entered, which was a small thing and shouldn't have mattered and did anyway. Mrs. Moretti, thank you for coming. He gestured to the chair across from him. Please. She sat. Carmen positioned herself near the door. Your husband has asked me to explain some options to you, Marcus said, opening the folder, specifically regarding documentation of ongoing harm. What can be filed? What would be needed? What the process looks like? He looked at her over the folder. He said you'd have questions, and that I should answer them honestly and completely without managing what you hear. She looked at the folder. At the tabs in it, each labeled with a different category of legal avenue. He told me that you've been subject to long-term abuse by a specific individual, and that you may have documentation and recollections that are legally significant, and that you needed to understand your options before deciding anything. Marcus folded his hands on the table. That's all he told me. The details are yours to share or not share at whatever pace you choose. She sat with that for a moment. He said one more thing, Marcus added. He said to tell you that he's not directing this, that these are your options for you to use or not use on your timeline. She looked at the folder. Then she opened it. They talked for 2 hours. Not about everything, not yet, because 2 hours with a stranger wasn't enough time for everything, and she was deliberate enough about her own safety to know the difference between what was ready to be said and what wasn't. but the outline of it, the shape, what existed in written form, what existed in memory, what could be reconstructed from records she hadn't known she was keeping until she was sitting across from a lawyer who knew how to make records mean something. When she left the office at 5, she had a card and a follow-up appointment, and the particular vertigo of someone who has spent 10 years standing at the edge of something and has for the first time taken a single step. Carmen walked beside her to the car and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. Luca was home by 6:30. She was waiting in the study, not because she'd been told to wait there, but because it was where she'd ended up after coming home, drawn by the bookshelves and the quiet, and the fact that the room faced the street, which meant she saw the car when it pulled up and saw him get out and stand for a moment on the sidewalk saying something to the man who'd driven him before coming inside. He came to the study doorway and stopped when he saw her. "Marcus called me," he said. "He said you were thorough." "I had things to say." She looked at him steadily. "You put that in motion today, while you were doing everything else. It needed to move quickly." He came into the room and sat not at the desk, but in one of the chairs across from the bookshelves. "Crow called your father today." Her spine tightened. "What did he say?" "Your father called me an hour ago. Sebastian told him that you'd shared some confidential family information with me, that you'd been emotional and said things that could cause problems." He met her eyes. "Your father wanted to know if it was true." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that you were my wife, and that our conversations were private, and that if he had concerns about the well-being of his daughter, he was welcome to call you directly." A pause. "He hasn't called you." She let out a slow breath. "He won't. He never calls unless Sebastian tells him to." She looked at her hands. "My father is not a cruel man. He's a weak one. There's a difference, but it doesn't. The outcome is the same." "The outcome was the same," Luca said. "It doesn't have to stay the same." She looked up. "What are you doing in terms of Sebastian? What's the actual plan?" "Evidence," he said. "That's the first step and the most important one, because Sebastian's armor is his reputation. Every layer of protection he has is built on what people believe about him. The moment that starts to crack with proof behind it, not just accusation, everything else follows." He leaned forward slightly. "You said you have information. Names, arrangements. What you've observed." She reached into her bag and produced the notebook. She'd been holding it since the attorney's office, turning over whether to do this, calibrating the risk. Because the notebook was 10 years. The notebook was everything she'd stored against the day she might be able to use it, and handing it to someone was handing over the only leverage she'd ever had. She put it on the table between them. "Everything I remember," she said. "Names, dates, connections. There's a fund, I overheard the structure of it once. I was 23. He'd forgotten I was in the room." She paused. "He does that. Forgets I'm in the room. He's been doing it for years." Luca looked at the notebook but didn't touch it. "May I?" She nodded. He picked it up and opened it, and she watched his eyes move across the first page. The small, careful handwriting, the dated entries, the names she'd recorded exactly as she'd heard them, and watched his expression do that thing it did when he was processing something significant, going very still, which meant the opposite of nothing going on. He turned pages. 1, 3, 7. He stopped at a page near the middle and looked at it for a long moment. "This name," he said. He pointed to a line she'd written 2 years ago. "You heard Crow say this name in connection with the fund. At a dinner. He was on the phone. He didn't know I was in the hallway." "This man has been at my table," Luca said. Not loudly, almost to himself. "He's attended 2 of my events this year." She watched his face. "You didn't know." "I didn't know." He closed the notebook and held it for a moment, and then set it down, and she could see him recalibrating, running through the implications, revising his understanding of the landscape he operated in. "This is more than I expected. I've been paying attention for 10 years. I know." He looked at her with something in his expression that she was still learning to read. I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to know that I'm aware of how much weight it has. She waited. What's in this notebook, he said, is enough to start dismantling what Sebastian Crow has built. Not all at once, not overnight, but strategically the financial connections, the political relationships, the people he's embedded in my own network. He tapped the notebook. This is a map. She had thought the same word. An hour ago in the coffee shop. Map. But, she said, because there was a but. But the moment we start using it, he'll know, Luca said, and he'll move first. He'll come after you not physically, not in a way anyone could point to, but reputationally, emotionally through your family. He'll try to isolate you, to make you look unstable before anything we say can land. He held her gaze. Are you prepared for that? She thought about 15 years old and a hallway and her father's expression when she'd tried to explain something to him that he'd decided not to understand. She thought about 10 years of carrying this alone. She thought about the notebook in Luca's hands and the attorney's business card in her pocket and Carmen's steady presence outside the door and the calls made at midnight that had been real at 6 in the morning. I've been living inside his version of that plan for 10 years already, she said. He already thinks I'm unstable. He already uses that. He's been using it since I was 17. She straightened in her chair. The difference now is that I have someone who doesn't need to take his word for it. Luca was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm going to ask you something that's none of my business, and you can tell me that. Ask. Are you sleeping? She blinked. Of all the things she'd expected him to say, that was not on the list. Yes, mostly. Last night. Some. She paused. I don't sleep well in new places, or I don't sleep well in general. It's something I've dealt with for a long time. He nodded slowly. I heard you, he said. At 3 in the morning, moving around upstairs. I didn't realize. I was awake too. He said it simply. I don't sleep much. Occupational characteristic. He stood up and she tracked the movement automatically, and he saw her do it. Saw the faint, involuntary adjustment of her posture, and stopped exactly where he was, and waited until she'd settled before moving again. She noticed that he did that. Had done it from the first night, stopped when she startled, waited. Never pushed through the space she'd created with her body. There's a kitchen, he said. At 2 in the morning, if you're awake and I'm awake, there's no reason to be awake alone in separate rooms. She looked at him. That's not... He looked briefly uncomfortable, which was such an unusual expression on him that she almost wanted to study it. I mean coffee. Or tea. Elena keeps things stocked. I work at the kitchen table at night sometimes. He stopped. That came out. I understood what you meant, she said. All right. She stood as well and she looked at him, this man who had remade her understanding of him 3 times in less than 48 hours, and said, Can I ask you something that's none of my business? He looked almost amused. Yes. Why aren't you afraid of Sebastian Crow? The almost amusement settled into something more serious. What makes you think I'm not? You're not, she said. I've watched men who are afraid of him for 10 years. I know what it looks like. He was quiet for a moment. Sebastian Crow has built his power on people being afraid to lose what he can take from them, he said. My money, my reputation in legitimate society, my relationships with people who occupy both worlds. He looked at her steadily. I stopped caring about the legitimate society version of my reputation before I was 30, and the things Sebastian Crow could take from me are not the things that actually matter to me. What matters to you? He held her gaze for a long, honest moment. Not becoming the kind of man who sees something wrong and does nothing about it, he said. That's what I'm afraid of. She stood there in the study with the winter dark outside the window and the notebook on the table between them and the weight of everything she'd said today still somewhere in her chest. And she thought about a sister he'd mentioned on their first night, a story told not for sympathy, but for context, and she thought about the specific quality of a man who understood what it cost to look away. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "Okay, okay." She reached out and picked up the notebook from the table. "I'm going to make copies of this. One for Marcus, one for you, one I keep." She looked at him. "And then we need to talk about the name you recognized, the one who's been at your table." "Yes, we do." "Tonight?" "Tonight." She tucked the notebook under her arm and walked to the doorway, and she stopped in it and looked back at him. A gesture she hadn't fully decided to make before she made it, and said, "You're not what I thought you were going to be." He looked at her with that careful, steady attention that she was beginning to realize was just how he looked at things, at everything. With his full regard, nothing held back. "Neither are you," he said. She went upstairs, and in the hallway outside her door, Carmen looked up from her book and nodded once, and Adriana nodded back, and she went into her room and sat on the edge of the bed, and held the notebook in both hands, and let herself feel just briefly the enormous and terrifying and quietly alive feeling of someone who is beginning very carefully, very slowly to fight back. Outside Chicago moved through its winter night. Sebastian Crowe was in his house somewhere in this city, certain that he was ahead of this. He wasn't ahead of this anymore. He just didn't know it yet. And Adriana Vale sat in a room with a locked door and a man on the floor below her who had been awake until midnight making calls on her behalf, and she opened her notebook to a fresh page, and she began to write. The copies were made by 7 in the morning. Adriana had been up since 5, sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook and a scanner. Elena had produced, without being asked, just appeared with it, the way Elena appeared with everything quietly and at precisely the right moment, and she had scanned every page, emailed one copy to Marcus Webb's secure address, saved one to an encrypted file Luca's tech person had set up the night before, and kept the original in the interior pocket of her coat where she could feel it against her ribs. Luca came down at 5:40 and found her there, and didn't say anything about the hour. He made 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her, and sat across the table with his phone. And they worked in parallel silence for 40 minutes, which was the most comfortable she had felt in a shared space with another person in longer than she could accurately measure. At 6:15, he looked up from his phone. "The name from the notebook," he said. "Daniel Reeves." She looked up. "You found something?" "I made some calls last night after you went upstairs." He set the phone on the table face up so she could see the screen, a financial document dense with numbers. "Reeves has been moving money through a structure that connects back to 2 shell companies. One of those companies has a registered agent address in common with a third company that Sebastian Crowe's personal attorney set up 8 years ago." She studied the screen. "That's not direct." "No, but it's a thread." He took the phone back. "Threads are how you unravel things. How long did it take you to find that?" "A few hours." She looked at him. "You slept." "Some." "Luca." She said his name with a specific weight. "You can't, this isn't something you should be losing sleep over on my—" "I'm not losing sleep over you," he said, which should have sounded dismissive and didn't. "I'm losing sleep over a man who has been operating inside my network for years without my knowledge. That's a problem that exists regardless of your situation. Your situation is what helped me see it." He looked at her steadily. "These are not the same crisis. They happen to intersect." She absorbed that. "You're angry." "Yes." "About Reeves." "About Reeves. About what he represents. About the idea that Sebastian Crowe has had people inside my organization watching me while I didn't know to look." He said it without any particular heat, which made it more serious, not less. "In my world, that kind of exposure has very specific consequences." "What kind of consequences?" He looked at her for a moment. "The kind I'm going to handle in ways that don't need to involve you." She understood what that meant. She had understood when she walked into this marriage what kind of man she was walking toward, and she had been afraid of exactly this, afraid of his world, his methods, the things that happened in the spaces she wasn't in. But sitting here in this kitchen at 6 in the morning, looking at the tiredness around his eyes and the quiet precision with which he handled information about the man who had destroyed significant parts of her life, she found herself feeling something she hadn't expected to feel. Grateful. Not dependent, not rescued, but grateful in the specific way of a person who has been carrying something alone for 10 years and has finally set part of it down. Somewhere it will be held. He's going to make a move, she said. Sebastian. Soon. He called my father, and that didn't work. And when things don't work, he escalates. I know. That's why we need to move first. Marcus said the documentation process takes time. The legal process takes time, Luca said. I'm not only working through legal channels. He picked up his coffee. There's going to be an event next week. Fitzgerald's annual fundraiser, the Mayor's Foundation. Sebastian will be there. Most of the people in that notebook will be there. She felt a cold clarity settle over her. You want me there. I want you there if you're willing. He was direct about it, no softening, no management. Because Sebastian's entire strategy depends on you being invisible, on being the woman people feel sorry for in private and overlook in public. The moment you're visible beside me, not hiding it, changes what story he can tell. He'll say I'm performing. Of course he will. He'll say a lot of things. Luca looked at her. But there will be people in that room who've heard rumors for years and chosen not to act on them because acting required courage they didn't have. Seeing you stand up, seeing you not afraid, will do something to some of those people. Not all of them, but some. Adriana looked at her coffee mug. She thought about the last fundraiser she'd attended with Sebastian present. The way she'd spent the entire evening managing her own face. The way she'd laughed at his jokes and accepted his hand on her back and stood inside the orbit of his reputation like a satellite with no trajectory of its own. All right, she said. He looked at her. You're sure? I'm not sure of anything, she said honestly, but I'm going. Yes. Sebastian called at 10 that morning with a different approach. No warmth this time, just efficiency. I've heard you've engaged an attorney, he said the moment she picked up. She didn't ask how he knew. She was past the point of being surprised by his information. I have legal representation, yes. That's a significant decision. A pause. Have you thought about what a legal process looks like from the outside? For you personally, a young woman married less than a week already filing. I haven't filed anything. Yet. The word landed with deliberate weight. The moment you do, Adriana, this becomes a public story. And public stories have a way of developing details that don't serve the person who started them. A pause. I've known you for 10 years. I know things about you that a reporter with the right incentive could find very interesting. Her hand tightened on the phone. She kept her breathing even. What kinds of things? She said. The hospitalization at 21. His voice was almost gentle. The reason you left that therapy practice after 6 weeks. The incident at the Vale family property in 2019 that your father had very quietly resolved. A pause. Things that could very easily be framed as evidence of instability. Of someone who has a long history of misinterpreting situations. She was quiet. I'm not threatening you, he said in the voice he used to say exactly that while doing exactly the opposite. I'm informing you of realities, as I've always done. I understand, she said. Good. Then you understand that the sensible path, Sebastian. She interrupted him, which she had not done in 10 years. The word came out clean and final, and there was a brief silence on the line that told her he'd registered it. I have to go. She ended the call before he could respond. She sat for 30 seconds, staring at the opposite wall. Her heart was beating very fast, and her hands were not entirely steady, and she was aware of both of those things in a clinical, observational way. Her body's reaction to a decade of trained fear, which was different from her mind's reaction, which was something new. Something that had started 2 days ago and was getting stronger. She picked up the phone and called Luca. He answered before the second ring. I heard it. She went still. What? Your phone, he said. Carmen's device mirrors yours for security purposes. I should have told you that. I apologize, that was a failure on my part. She processed this. In another context with another person, she would have experienced this as exactly the kind of surveillance that had kept her trapped. She sat with the feeling for a moment and examined it and found that it felt different, not because she'd decided it was fine, but because the reasoning behind it was verifiable and the disclosure was immediate and the apology was direct. You heard the call, she said. Yes, the hospitalization he mentioned. She took a breath. I need you to know about it before he uses it because he will use it. You don't have to tell me. I know I don't have to. She looked at her hands. I was 21. I was in a very bad period and I made a decision I've spent years being used as leverage about. A pause. It was one night. I was admitted, I was evaluated. I was released the next morning. My father arranged for the record to be handled discreetly. She paused. Sebastian arranged it. I didn't know at the time that he was the one who made that call. I found out later that he'd used it as he kept it, as something he could use. Luca was very quiet on the other end of the line. I don't want your pity, she said. I want you to know what he has before he deploys it. I know, he said. And I want you to know that what you just told me doesn't change a single thing about this situation, not from my side. She absorbed that. The 2019 incident at the Vale property, she said. That was... She stopped. That was the last time I tried to leave. To actually leave. There was a confrontation. Sebastian was there. The confrontation escalated, and afterward he had his people describe it as me having an episode. My father accepted that version. It was easier than the alternative. Where were his people when the confrontation was happening? A pause. Outside the room. So there were witnesses to his arrival and your state afterward, but not to what happened in between. That's how he operates. She kept her voice level. He's never once been in a room where someone could see both the action and the consequence. Until now, Luca said. He called a phone that was being monitored. He just described two separate pieces of information he intends to weaponize against you. That's recorded. She blinked. Is that admissible? That's a question for Marcus, but it exists. A pause. Are you all right? I'm fine. Adriana. I will be... She corrected herself. I will be fine. That's more accurate, he said. I'll be home by 5. We need to talk about the Fitzgerald event. The week before the Fitzgerald fundraiser moved faster than any week she could remember. Marcus had 3 meetings with her. The documentation was building not quickly enough to feel like a weapon yet, but solidly the way foundations are built out of sight, unspectacular, and load-bearing. He had connected with 2 other attorneys who had handled cases involving men like Sebastian Crow. Men who built their protection out of reputation and access, and the reluctance of institutions to believe what they were being shown. One of those attorneys had a client who had never been named publicly, who had a story that paralleled Adriana's in ways that made her throat tighten when Marcus described the shape of it, not the details. He protected his client's details, but the shape. She was not the only one. She had known this in the abstract, the way you know things that are too large to fully hold. But hearing it described in a law office on LaSalle Street by a man with a file folder and a careful voice made it specific in a new way. Sebastian Crow had been doing this longer than 10 years and to more than one person, and he had built his system so thoroughly that each individual person had believed, as she had believed, that they were alone in it. She drove home from that meeting in the back of the car with Carmen in the front seat and spent the ride not speaking and not crying, which required a certain amount of work. At home, she went looking for Luca. She found him in the study on a call that ended when she appeared in the doorway. He looked at her face and said to whoever was on the phone, "I'll call you back," and set the phone down. "Marcus told me I'm not the only one," she said. He was quiet. "He didn't give me details, but there's another person, at least one." She came into the room and sat because she needed to sit. "How long has he been doing this?" "We're still building the picture," Luca said carefully. "How long?" The earliest we can document is 18 years ago. He held her gaze as he said it, didn't look away, didn't manage her reaction. There may be earlier. She sat with that. 18 years. She had been 7 years old, 18 years ago. Sebastian Crow had been hurting people since before she was old enough to know what that meant, and he had been doing it inside a life that looked from every angle that mattered to the people around him like the life of a decent man. He was going to keep doing it, she said. Yes. If nothing changed, if I'd stayed invisible, he was just going to keep... Yes. Luca said it without softening it, because she hadn't asked him to soften it. That's why this matters. She nodded slowly. She wasn't surprised. She'd known this in the way she knew things she'd rather not know. But knowing and hearing it confirmed in a study on a Thursday evening were different experiences, and she gave herself 30 seconds to let them be different. Then she straightened. "The Fitzgerald event," she said. "Tell me what you need from me." The night of the fundraiser arrived with the specific quality of a night that matters the air. Thin, the details, sharp everything slightly more present than usual. She dressed deliberately. Not to look fragile, not to perform anything. She chose the dress she'd have chosen if she were choosing for herself, which was something she'd had so little practice doing that she stood in front of her closet for 10 minutes before Carmen appeared in the doorway and said, "The blue one?" and pointed. And Adriana looked at it and said, "Yes." And that was settled. In the car, Luca said, "You don't have to stay the whole night." "I know. If you want to leave at any point, I'll tell you." She looked at him. "Stop managing my exits. I'll tell you if I need one." He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, something that might have been from a certain angle respect. "All right," he said. The venue was a hotel ballroom with 700 guests, and the kind of ambient noise that came from money and power, and the particular cocktail of performance that attended events where both were present. She had been to dozens of events like this. She knew how to move in them, what to say, how to stand, how to be in a room full of people watching her without betraying anything. What she didn't know was how to be in a room like this with someone beside her who was on her side. It was a stranger feeling than she'd expected. Sebastian was there. She saw him within 4 minutes of arriving across the room, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, the center of a small cluster of people who were listening to him with the attentive expressions of people who found him worth listening to. He didn't see her immediately. She had approximately 3 minutes of watching him before his attention swept the room in the automatic way of someone who always knew where everyone was. His eyes landed on her and went very still. She held his gaze. She had never done that before. Not directly. Not without looking away first. She held his gaze for 4 full seconds, and then she looked away, not flinching, not fleeing, just turning her attention to something else. And she felt Luca's hand at the small of her back, steady and present, not possessive, just there. "He saw you," Luca said quietly. "I know." "How are you? Functioning?" She glanced up at him. "Ask me again in an hour." They moved through the room. She spoke to people. That part she could do automatically. The social navigation of events like this was as ingrained as breathing. But something was different tonight. She was different tonight, and some people noticed. The wife of a federal judge pulled her aside near the bar and said quietly that she'd always thought Adriana was remarkable and was glad to see her looking. She paused and chose the word carefully strong. A woman who ran a nonprofit in the South Loop shook her hand and held it a beat longer than necessary and looked at her with an expression that was specific in a way Adriana recognized from looking in mirrors. She wasn't the only one here either. That thought arrived and settled, and she filed it somewhere important. Sebastian reached them at 40 minutes in. He moved through the crowd with his usual ease, greeting people as he passed, touching shoulders, producing the warm smile that had always made her feel slightly unhinged by contrast, because the disparity between the public face and the private reality was always most vertiginous in moments like this. He stopped in front of them, and he extended his hand to Luca and Luca shook it with the precise amount of grip that communicated exactly nothing, which was itself a communication. "Moretti," Sebastian said. "Congratulations are still in order. You're a fortunate man." "I know it," Luca said. Sebastian turned to her. His eyes were exactly as warm as they always were in public. "Adriana, you look beautiful." "Thank you, Sebastian. I hope the transition has been smooth." The warmth never flickering. The warmth was extraordinary. She had always found it extraordinary in the way you find something extraordinary that is also monstrous. New household, new city of operations. That's a great deal of change. "She's adapted exceptionally," Luca said. "She's exceptional in general. It's something I'm still getting used to." Something very small and very controlled moved in Sebastian's expression. If she hadn't been watching for it, hadn't spent 10 years learning to read the micro-movements of his face, she'd have missed it. The shift that happened when something didn't go according to the script he'd written. He had expected, she realized, for her to be quiet and managed. To stand beside her husband and be a beautiful accessory and let Sebastian run the conversation as he had always run their interactions in public. Luca wasn't giving him that. "I've been wanting to speak with you, actually," Luca said to Sebastian. His tone was light, the way his tone was sometimes light in a way that had nothing to do with lightness. "About some financial matters. Some mutual connections who've come up in my regular review process." The micro-movement in Sebastian's face again. Controlled this instant. "Of course. I'm always happy to be useful." "Daniel Reeves," Luca said. Just the name. Dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water. Sebastian's expression did not change, but something happened to the quality of his stillness. It went from natural to manufactured. Adriana felt the change the way you feel a shift in air pressure. "I know Daniel," Sebastian said. "I know you do. I'd like to understand the nature of that relationship a bit better." Luca's voice was still light, socially light. "In my experience, understanding the connections in my network is just good practice." "Of course," Sebastian said. "We should set up a time." "I'll have someone call your office." Luca looked at him pleasantly. "Enjoy the evening." Sebastian looked at Adriana. In 10 years, she had seen many of his looks. She had catalogued them, labeled them, learned which ones preceded which events. This one she had seen before. It was the one that came when he had decided to recalibrate. When he'd received new information and was revising what it required. He had not expected Luca to be this specific. This fast. "Adriana," he said, and her name in his mouth was the same as it had always been. But something was different now, and she realized what it was. She was watching it happen from the outside instead of the inside. For the first time in 10 years, she was on the other side of his expression, not inside his script, watching it from the audience. "Sebastian," she said. He left. She watched him go, and she breathed, and she thought that was something. That was the first time she had stood in a room with Sebastian Crowe and not moved to accommodate him. Not shifted her position, not adjusted her expression, not redirected the conversation to relieve the pressure. She had stood beside her husband and watched a man try to perform normalcy and felt for the first time that the performance was his problem. "You're shaking," Luca said quietly beside her. "I know." She was. Very slightly. Her hands were not visible. She was holding her clutch in front of her, but the tremor was there. Adrenaline, old fear, and new something else running through the same channels. "It's adrenaline. I'm fine." "I know you are." "He's going to make a move tonight," she said. "He left too quickly. He's going to regroup and then he's going to do something. Probably." "What are we going to do when he does?" "Watch," Luca said. "And let him do it where people can see." She understood. A man like Sebastian pushed into a corner would perform his response for the room, and his performance would be shaped by a decade of believing she was alone and afraid and manageable. He didn't know she had a notebook that had become a legal document. He didn't know about Marcus Webb's second client. He didn't know how many calls had been made in how many directions. He was going to respond to a version of her that no longer existed. It took 22 minutes. She was speaking with the judge's wife, genuinely speaking with her, had discovered in the past 10 minutes that this woman was sharp and funny, and had very specific things to say about the intersections of philanthropy and politics that were actually interesting when the energy in the room changed. It was subtle, the way a current changes direction underwater. She didn't hear what was being said across the room, but she saw heads turning, saw the specific quality of attention that meant information was moving. Carmen appeared at her elbow. "Someone's been talking to a reporter," she said quietly. "There's a woman with a press credential near the north entrance who's been speaking with 3 of Crow's people in the past 10 minutes. The conversation has been about you." Adriana kept her expression entirely still. "What kind of conversation?" "Your history, the hospitalization, framed as a concern. A friend of the family worried about your mental state given the sudden marriage. 10 years ago, this would have worked. This exact move. The concerned friend narrative. The quiet word to the right person. The implication of instability delivered through channels that left his hands clean. This had worked before. Had worked at 21, had worked at 23. Had worked every time she'd gotten close to the edge of his control. She handed her glass to Carmen. "Get Luca," she said. "He's already coming." He was. She saw him moving through the room from the direction of the bar, and she could tell by the angle of his jaw that someone had already reached him. Probably one of his people who were stationed at various points she'd stopped trying to identify. He arrived beside her. "I heard. I know what he's doing. So do I." He looked at her. "There's a choice here. We leave, and he writes the story that we left because you were upset. Or we stay and we decide what the next 30 minutes look like." She looked at the room around her. 700 people, many of whom were right now processing something that had been whispered into their ear by Sebastian Crow's network. Processing it through the lens of what they knew or thought they knew about Adriana Vale. The quiet daughter, the troubled girl, the woman who had married the Mafia boss, suddenly and then apparently needed to have her mental state worried about publicly. She thought about being 15 years old and terrified and alone. She thought about being 17 and watching her father choose someone else's version of reality. She thought about the notebook in her coat lining and the attorney on LaSalle Street and the woman in this room right now whose own expression had told Adriana without a word that she understood something about the specific nature of Sebastian Crow's attention. "I want to speak to the reporter," she said. Luca went very still. "Adriana, not about everything, not tonight. But I want to speak to her before Sebastian's people finish framing whatever story she's being handed." She looked at him. "I've been the subject of other people's stories for 10 years. I know what it feels like to have someone else write the first sentence. I'm not going to let that happen tonight." He held her gaze for a long moment. "What are you going to say?" he said. "I'm going to tell her that I'm aware that someone at this event has been making statements about my mental health to members of the press. I'm going to tell her that I would strongly encourage her to investigate the motive of whoever is sharing that information, and that I look forward to having a more complete conversation at an appropriate time." She looked at him steadily. "Nothing about Sebastian, nothing about the case, nothing that gives Marcus a problem. Just me not being managed." He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, "Carmen will go with you." "I know." She moved through the room. She found the reporter near the north entrance, young alert, the kind of professional attention that meant she was actually looking for a story, and not just being fed one. She looked up when Adriana approached, and the alertness sharpened into something more specific. "Mrs. Moretti," she said. "I wasn't expecting." "I know." Adriana looked at her. "I understand you've been speaking with some guests tonight about me." The reporter's expression was careful. "I've been doing some background research. I'm aware of the background you've been given," Adriana said. Her voice was level, not hostile, not performing distress, just level. "I want you to know that I know where it came from and I want to suggest that before you do anything with it, you think carefully about the source and what that source's interest might be in having that particular story told." She held the reporter's gaze. "I'm not in a position to talk tonight, but I will be." She paused. "And when I am, I'll have something worth listening to. Not a he said, she said. Documentation. A timeline. More than one voice." The reporter was writing nothing down. But she was listening with a quality of attention that meant she was recording everything in the way that actually matters. "Can I ask?" the reporter started. "Not tonight," Adriana said. "But yes, eventually." She reached into her clutch and produced one of Marcus Webb's cards. "This is my attorney. When you're ready to have a real conversation, start there." She turned and walked back into the room. She found Luca where she'd left him. He watched her cross the room toward him, and his expression was doing something she didn't have a name for yet, something between surprise and the absence of surprise, the look of someone whose expectations are being revised in a direction they didn't expect, but find they're not objecting to. "How did it go?" he said. "I think she'll make different choices about what she does tonight." She stopped beside him. "I didn't say anything damaging. I just made it complicated for Sebastian's version to be the only one she has." "That was—" He stopped. "What?" "You were—" He looked at her with that full, careful attention she was becoming familiar with. "I've watched people handle situations like that for a long time. What you just did, that was not how someone afraid handles something." "I am afraid," she said honestly. "I've been afraid every minute tonight." "I know. But afraid doesn't mean stopped." She looked at him. I learned that from a lot of years of not having another option." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I owe you an apology." She blinked. "For what?" "I thought tonight would be harder for you." He held her gaze. "I was prepared to manage it if it was. I was wrong to prepare that. You don't need managing." She looked at him. "No," she said. "I don't." Across the room she could see Sebastian Crow watching them. His expression had settled into the particular neutrality of a man recalculating. He had expected her to be shaking and invisible, and instead she was standing in the center of the room, looking back at him. And the woman he'd spent 10 years reducing to compliance was looking back at him like someone who was done being reduced. He looked away first. She noticed. Luca noticed her noticing. "It's not over," he said quietly. "That wasn't... He's not done." "I know." She turned away from Sebastian deliberately. "But that was the first time I've watched him look away first. How does it feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like the beginning of something," she said. "Not the end of something. The beginning." Luca nodded. She reached for a glass of water from a passing tray and stood beside him in the noise and light of the ballroom and felt the specific sensation of having taken a step that couldn't be taken back. Not victory, not safety, but movement forward, irreversible hers. Sebastian Crow was still in the room. He would make more calls tonight. He would redraw his strategy and find new angles, and use the things he knew against the things she was building. And the fight would get harder before it got easier. Because men like Sebastian did not accept the loss of control without a significant response. She knew all of this. She stood there knowing it and felt the fear of it, and felt something else alongside the fear, something that had started as a thread on the first night and had been getting stronger every day. Every call made, every page of the notebook, every conversation with Marcus, every morning she'd woken up in a house where the door locked from the inside. Something that felt like it might, given enough time, and enough proof, and enough people finally looking in the right direction, become unstoppable. The night wasn't over, but she was still in the room. The story ran 4 days after the Fitzgerald fundraiser. Not the story Sebastian had been engineering, not the concerned friend narrative about mental instability and a hasty marriage. A different story. The reporter whose name was Dana Kearse and who wrote for a publication that covered Chicago's intersections of wealth and power, and the things that happened in those intersections that the people involved preferred not to have examined, had made a choice. She had taken Adriana's card. She had called Marcus Webb's office the following morning. And while she hadn't published anything about Sebastian Crowe, specifically, not yet. Marcus had been clear that the timeline on that needed to be controlled. She had published something about a pattern. About the way powerful men in Chicago's philanthropic circles used access and reputation as insulation. About the specific vulnerability of women who were connected to those men through family rather than professional choice. No names, but a shape that anyone paying attention would recognize. Sebastian Crowe's phone rang for 2 solid days after it published. Adriana knew this because Luca's people had been monitoring Sebastian's communication patterns since the fundraiser, and the volume spike was dramatic and specific. He was managing. He was calling in favors, reassuring people, applying pressure to anyone who might be thinking about what the article meant in connection with what they already half knew. He was busy, which meant he was reactive. Which meant for the first time in 10 years, Adriana was not the one responding to his moves. He was responding to hers. She sat in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, reading the article for the 3rd time, when Luca came downstairs, and she set the phone face down on the table and looked at him, and he looked back at her and said, "How are you feeling?" "Like I should feel more frightened than I do," she said honestly. "But you don't." "I feel..." She thought about it. Purposeful. Like something is moving in a direction that has its own momentum now. She looked at her coffee. "That might be naive." "It's not naive," he said. "Momentum is real. It's also not the same as invincible." "I know." He sat down across from her. "He's going to try something more direct." The article rattled his network. When someone like Sebastian gets rattled, he stops being strategic and starts being reactive. Reactive people make decisions that strategic people don't. "Mistakes," she said. "Mistakes," he confirmed. "We need to be ready for that." She nodded and picked up her phone again. Then she set it back down and looked at him directly. "I have a meeting today, not with Marcus, something I arranged on my own." He waited. "There's a woman," she said. "Marcus told me about her, not her name, not her details, but that she exists and that she has a story that parallels mine. I asked Marcus to ask if she would meet with me." She held his gaze. She said yes, today at noon. Luca was quiet for a moment. "How are you planning to handle that?" "Carefully," she said. "I'm not going in with an agenda. She stopped and found the honest version of it. "I've spent 10 years thinking I was alone in this. Knowing I'm not is one thing. Sitting across from someone who actually knows what it felt like, that's something else." "Where are you meeting?" "A coffee shop in Wicker Park. Carmen will be with me." She looked at him. "I'm not asking permission." "I know you're not." Something moved in his expression, that look she'd been learning, the one that landed somewhere between steady and warm. "I'm asking because I need to know your location, not because I have opinions about what you do with your afternoon." She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. "I know," she said quieter. "I know the difference." And she did now. She was beginning to. The woman's name was Claire. She was 41 years old, dark-haired, with the particular quality of someone who had spent years learning to seem more comfortable than they were, a skill Adriana recognized from the inside out. She was already at the table when Adriana arrived, both hands around a coffee cup, and she looked up with an expression that was cautious, and also underneath the caution, something fragile with relief. "You look like what I expected," Claire said when they'd been sitting across from each other for approximately 30 seconds. "From Marcus's description, he described you as..." She paused. "Someone who was further along than he expected." "Further along in what way?" Adriana asked. "In not being afraid anymore." Claire looked at her steadily. "Or still afraid but not stopped by it." "I'm still afraid," Adriana said. "Every day. But you went to the Fitzgerald event." Claire wrapped her hands tighter around her cup. "I heard about that. I have people who were there told me." "You have people watching him too." "I've been watching him for 6 years," Claire said. "From a safe distance. from the distance of someone who never believed they'd get close enough to do anything about it. She looked at Adriana. You married Luca Moretti. Yes. That changes the geometry of things. Yes, Adriana said. It does. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then, what I experienced, what Sebastian did, it started when I was working for a foundation he chaired. I was 32. I thought I understood what kind of man he was. I thought I was good at reading people. She let out a short, controlled breath. The escalation was so gradual. By the time I understood what was happening, I had made choices that he had very careful documentation of. Choices that out of context, she stopped. He used them against you, Adriana said. He made me understand that he had them, Claire said. That was enough. I never tested what he'd actually do with them because the threat of it was sufficient to... She looked at her cup. I left the foundation. I moved to a different part of the city. I changed careers. I rebuilt my life around the assumption that the price of my freedom was his continued security. Adriana looked at this woman, 41 years old, careful and smart, and carrying something she'd been carrying for 9 years, and felt the recognition of it like a physical thing. He has something on you, Adriana said. Something specific. Yes. And you've been managing around it since you left. Yes. Do you want to stop managing around it? Adriana said. Claire looked up. Her expression was the specific expression of someone who has wanted something for so long that being asked directly about wanting it is almost more than they can process. Yes, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I've wanted to stop for 9 years. Adriana reached across the table and set her hand on top of Claire's. Not a dramatic gesture. Not performed, just a hand on top of another hand, the gesture of someone who understood from the inside what another person was carrying. Then let's talk about what that looks like, she said. They talked for 2 hours. When Adriana left, the shape of things had changed. Claire had agreed to speak with Marcus. She hadn't agreed to go on record yet. That was still too far for where she was. But she'd agreed to speak with him, and speaking with Marcus was always the first real step, because Marcus had the specific gift of making the possible seem survivable. In the car going home, Carmen looked at her in the rearview mirror and said, Good meeting. Yes, Adriana said. A very good meeting. She stared out the window at Chicago moving past and thought about the word geometry. The geometry of things. She had spent 10 years inside a geometry that had been built around her, shaped so that all lines led back to Sebastian, so that every exit curved back into his control. The geometry hadn't changed all at once. It was changing piece by piece, corner by corner, one conversation and one document, and one person choosing to sit across from another person and say, yes, I want to stop. She was building a new shape. The thought was terrifying, and also underneath the terror, something else. Something that felt like it was hers. The direct move, when it came, arrived on a Tuesday. She was at Marcus's office for their regular meeting when Marcus's assistant knocked and came in with the particular expression of someone delivering information that has changed the quality of the day. He handed Marcus a folder. Marcus opened it. Read for 15 seconds. Closed it. Sebastian Crow filed a motion this morning, Marcus said. He looked at Adriana with the steady composure of someone delivering bad news without dramatizing it. He's petitioning for an emergency psychological evaluation. Citing, he opened the folder again. Documented history of mental health instability, recent erratic behavior, and a pattern of false allegations against respected community figures. Adriana felt the cold of it move through her and kept her face still. He's filing against whom? She said. Against you as grounds to... Marcus paused. It's a preemptive filing. It's designed to create a legal record that characterizes you as an unreliable narrator before you can create any legal record of your own. Can he do that? He can file it, Marcus said. Whether it goes anywhere is a different question. What does it do while it's pending? It creates noise, Marcus said. It creates a narrative in the legal record that he can point to. It makes your word and the word of anyone aligned with you something that a judge would have to weigh against an existing characterization. She sat with that for a moment. 10 years of him informing her of realities, and here was another one he had gotten to the legal system before she had. He had moved first. She had known he would. She had not known it would feel this specific. "What do we do?" she said. "We respond," Marcus said. "And we respond very quickly, because the first 48 hours of a filing like this determine what the story becomes." He looked at her steadily. "I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer." "Ask." Is there anything he could produce, any record, any documentation of anything you've done in the past 10 years, that would be difficult to explain in context? She thought about 21, about the hospitalization, about the 2019 incident at the Vale property, about 3 years of therapy records, 2 of which predated her understanding that her therapist's notes had been accessed. She told him everything, all of it. Every piece she'd been protecting, every part of her own story, she'd been managing and holding back because it felt like ammunition that would be pointed at her. She laid it out on Marcus Webb's conference table in a 50-minute recitation that left her with a headache behind her eyes and hands that weren't quite steady, and Marcus listened without interrupting and took notes without reacting, and at the end of it he looked at her and said, "None of that is what he thinks it is." "What do you mean?" "Every single thing you just described," Marcus said, "is evidence of a woman responding to sustained abuse. The hospitalization, the 2019 confrontation, the therapy. When properly contextualized, and I know how to contextualize it, every one of those things becomes part of a timeline that shows what was being done to you, not who you are." He leaned forward slightly. "He has been using your history of surviving him as evidence that you're unstable. I'm going to use it as evidence that you survived." She looked at him. "That," she said carefully, "is something I had not considered." "That's my job," Marcus said. "To see what other people are trying to weaponize and understand it differently." He stood. "I need to make some calls. I'm going to need Claire." Adriana's chest tightened. "She's not ready. I know. I'm not going to push her into anything. But I need to let her know what's happening because it affects her situation as well." He looked at Adriana. "Can you reach out to her first, so she hears it from you before she hears it from my office?" "Yes," Adriana said. "I'll call her today." She left Marcus's office and sat in the car and called Claire and told her directly and clearly what had happened and what Marcus needed and what Claire's choice was entirely and completely hers to make. She didn't ask. She didn't pressure. She said, "Here is the situation. Here is what I'm doing. Here is where I stand. And whatever you decide, I will still be here." Claire was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He filed against you to protect himself." "Yes." "Because you scared him." Adriana thought about this. About Sebastian Crow, who had never once been scared of her in 10 years, filing a preemptive legal motion within 2 weeks of her standing in a ballroom and holding his gaze and not looking away first. "Apparently," she said. Another silence. "Tell Marcus I'll come in," Claire said. "Thursday." Adriana closed her eyes. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Claire said. "I'm doing it for me. That's the first decision I've made for myself in 9 years. That's exactly the right reason." She told Luca that evening, sitting at the kitchen table where she'd come to understand that the important conversations happened not in formal rooms, not in the study, but here in the ordinary space of the kitchen, where things got said in the language of people who were actually talking to each other. He listened without interrupting. He had that quality she'd noticed it from the beginning, but was still struck by it, of being someone who actually listened, not someone who was waiting for their turn to respond. When she finished, he said, "He made a mistake. Filing the motion." "Filing the motion," he confirmed. "He's on defense now. He made a move that tells us exactly where he's afraid." He looked at her. A man who was confident would have waited. He'd have let the noise from the article die down and then moved quietly. Instead, he filed something public within 4 days. He held her gaze. He's afraid of you. She sat with that. He filed something that names me, she said. My mental health history, my character. Yes, there will be people who read that and believe it. Some, Luca said, and there will be people who read it and understand exactly why a man files an emergency psychological evaluation against his accuser before any formal allegation is made. He paused. Smart people, when they see a move like that, ask what the person making it is afraid of. Smart people know that emergency preemptive filings don't come from confidence. They come from panic. Dana Kearse will hear about the filing, Adriana said. Yes, I imagine she already has. Should I talk to her? He looked at her. This was the thing that had changed between them over the past weeks. She noticed it in moments like this, the specific quality of the question. She wasn't asking his permission. She was asking his view as someone whose view she had come to trust on a decision that was hers. What does Marcus say? Luca asked. Marcus says to let the filing speak for itself for 24 hours and then decide. She looked at her hands. I think I want to talk to her. I think the filing changes what I can say. He made my situation public when he filed. That changes the calculation about what I'm allowed to respond to. Then trust that, Luca said. She looked up. You've been reading this situation correctly since the first night, he said. You knew he'd move quickly. You knew he'd use the things he had. You've been ahead of it every step, not because of me, not because of Marcus, because you've been paying attention to this man for 10 years, and you understand how he thinks. He held her gaze. Trust what you know. She sat with that in a way she wasn't sure she'd sat with anything in a long time. Not managing it, not immediately filing it into a category of things to be careful of, just sitting with it. Someone telling her to trust what she knew. I need to tell you something, she said. He waited. When I married you, she said, I had a plan, a very limited plan, which was to get through the situation and find some margin of safety and wait. She looked at him steadily. I didn't expect any of this. I didn't expect you to be what you've been. I didn't expect to feel... She stopped. You don't have to say it, he said. I want to. She kept looking at him. I didn't expect to feel like someone was on my side. I've been trying to figure out what to do with that for 3 weeks. What have you figured out? He said. That I'm not good at it yet, she said. At accepting it. At not waiting for the part where it gets taken away. She paused. But I'm better at it than I was 3 weeks ago. He looked at her with that full, careful attention. That's enough, he said. That's more than enough. The kitchen was quiet around them, and outside the city went about its Chicago winter business, and inside this house that had been his, and was becoming something she didn't have a word for yet. Adriana Vale sat across from the man who was her husband, and felt in the complicated and non-linear way that true things always arrive, something she recognized as the beginning of trust. Not complete, not uncomplicated, not without the residue of 10 years of very good reasons not to trust, but present, growing, hers. Dana Kearse called the next morning at 9:15. I've seen the filing, she said without preamble when Adriana answered. I want to give you the opportunity to respond before I write about it. Adriana was in her sitting room, Carmen in the hallway, coffee cooling on the end table. She had been waiting for this call, not specifically expecting it this morning, but waiting for it in the way you wait for something you know is coming. What would you write if I didn't respond? Adriana asked. The facts of the filing, Dana said, which speak for themselves actually, but context changes meaning. A pause. I've also been doing some research. In the past 2 weeks. Not just for this story. There's a pattern here that goes back further than what I initially understood. How far back? 18 years, Dana said. Maybe more. Adriana's throat tightened. You talked to someone. I talked to several people who aren't named in the filing and aren't connected to you directly." Dana's voice was careful and professional, and also, underneath the professionalism, genuinely angry in the way that reporters sometimes were when they found something. "Mrs. Moretti, what Sebastian Crow filed yesterday is I've covered this city for 15 years. I've never seen a preemptive psychological evaluation filing used quite this precisely, quite this quickly." "He's good at preemptive," Adriana said. "I know. I'm starting to understand how good." A pause. "I'd like to meet with you, today if possible. I'll need to loop in my attorney." "Of course." "This afternoon," Adriana said. "Marcus Webb's office, 3 o'clock. She ended the call and sat for a moment, and then, instead of calling Marcus first, she walked to the window and stood there looking out at the winter city, and allowed herself to feel the magnitude of what was happening. Not to manage it, not to file it, just to feel it. 3 weeks ago, she had been a woman who had arranged her entire internal life around containment, around making herself small enough to stay safe, managing her reactions so precisely that even her own emotions had sometimes felt like performances of emotions rather than the emotions themselves. She had been contained for so long that she had started to confuse containment with survival. They were not the same thing. Survival was this. This morning, this call, this meeting at 3 o'clock. This slow and terrifying and irreversible process of becoming visible. She called Marcus. Then she called Luca. Then she went downstairs and ate breakfast, and planned her afternoon, and did not for the first time in 10 years spend any part of that planning trying to anticipate what Sebastian Crow would want her to do about it. The meeting with Dana lasted 3 hours. Adriana did not tell her everything. She told her what could be told at this stage, the shape of the timeline, the pattern of the behavior, the way the system around Sebastian had been structured to make each individual incident seem like an isolated misunderstanding, rather than part of a sustained and deliberate course of action. She was careful. Marcus was beside her being careful. But she was also honest in a way she had not been with a person outside of this particular circle since she was 17 years old and had tried to be honest and paid for it. The difference was that this honesty had somewhere to go. Dana listened. She asked questions that were precise and showed she had done real work before walking into this room. She did not perform sympathy. She did not offer reassurance. She engaged with Adriana as someone who had information that mattered and deserved to be treated as such, and that the simple act of being treated as someone whose account was credible by default, without having to prove it, without having to perform distress or manage the other person's discomfort, that did something to Adriana that she hadn't expected. It made her sit up straighter. She was 40 minutes into the conversation when she said something she hadn't planned to say. "He told me once," she said, "that the reason people would never believe me is because the distance between who he appeared to be and what I was describing was too large. That the mind goes to the more comfortable explanation, that people choose the version of events that requires them to do less." She looked at Dana. He was right about that. For 10 years he was right. "He's not right anymore," Dana said. "No." Adriana met her eyes. "Because the distance has gotten smaller. Because there are multiple people saying the same thing from different directions. Because he filed a legal motion that any intelligent person can read and understand as what it is." She paused. "The comfortable explanation is running out of room." Dana looked at her for a moment, then wrote something in her notebook. "Can I ask you a personal question?" Dana said. "Off the record." "Ask." "Are you okay?" Adriana looked at her. In the past 3 weeks, she had been asked versions of this question by Luca, by Marcus, by Carmen, by Elena, who asked with soup rather than words. She had gotten better at answering it honestly. "I'm getting there," she said. "I'm better than I was 3 weeks ago. I'll be better in 3 months than I am now." She paused. "I spent 10 years not answering that question honestly. I'm still relearning what honest feels like." Dana nodded, closed her notebook. "For what it's worth," Dana said, "you seem to me like someone who has been honest the whole time, and that has been the problem, not the solution, because you were honest in a system designed to make honesty useless." Adriana sat with that. That's... She stopped, tried again. Yes, that's exactly it. She left Marcus's office at 6:15 with Carmen beside her and the cold Chicago air on her face, and the particular exhaustion of someone who has been fully present for 3 hours. Not the hollow exhaustion of performing. The real kind. The kind that came from having used yourself genuinely. She was tired, and she was clear, and she was more herself than she had been at 6 in the evening on any day in recent memory. In the car, she leaned her head back and looked at the ceiling and thought about Claire's voice on the phone saying, "I'm doing it for me. The first decision I've made for myself in 9 years." She thought about what it would mean for her own decisions, the ones still ahead, the ones that would be harder than a meeting with a journalist, the ones that would require her to stand somewhere completely exposed with nothing between her and the weight of what Sebastian Crowe had made her carry. The legal process that Marcus had described as slow and difficult, and worth it. The conversations with her father that hadn't happened yet and needed to. The long project of unbecoming what 10 years of control had made her, and becoming not who she'd been before, because before was 15 years old, and before couldn't be returned to, but who she was becoming now, in this house, in this city, in this strange and uncharted life. She was tired and clear and alive in the specific way of someone moving through something real. Luca was waiting when she got home. Not obviously waiting. He was in the kitchen, working phone in hand, the normal operations of a man who ran complicated things. But he looked up the moment she came in and set down the phone entirely, not placing it face down or setting it aside, but putting it all the way down, and he looked at her with that full attention she'd come to depend on more than she'd intended to. "How was it?" he said. She set her bag down and sat across from him and said, "She's going to write something real." "I know. Marcus called me." "Not tonight's version, not a response to the filing piece. Something bigger, something that actually names him." She met his eyes. "She needs more time to build it correctly. She needs Claire to be ready. She needs it to be airtight because a story about a man like Sebastian in a publication like hers has to be something he can't dismiss or bury or turn into proof of instability on our part." "That makes sense." "But it's coming," she said. I could tell. I could tell by the way she was talking about it, not as a question of if, but of when. She looked at Luca. "He's going to try more things between now and then." "Yes." "I'm ready for that," she said. He looked at her. "I know you are." "I want to..." She paused. Found the words carefully. "I want to be the one who does the next thing, the next step. I don't want to be responding to him anymore. I want to decide what happens next." Luca was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you want to do?" She had thought about this on the drive home, had turned it over against the car, ceiling had held it up to the light of everything Marcus had said, and everything Dana had confirmed, and everything Claire had chosen. "My father," she said. "He's been the last piece of Sebastian's access to me. Not the only piece, but the one that's still unresolved." She looked at Luca steadily. "I need to have a real conversation with my father. Not the conversation he expects, not me managing his comfort." She paused. "A real one." Luca held her gaze. "Do you want me to be there?" he said. She thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, rather than giving the automatic answer about handling things herself. "No," she said finally. "I need to do that one alone. But I need to know you're here when I get back." "I'll be here," he said. "All right." She stood. Felt the full weight of the day in her body, not unpleasant, just real. "I'm going to sleep tonight," she said. "An actual full night." "Good. I haven't done that in..." She stopped. "In a long time." "I know," he said. "Sleep." She was almost to the hallway when she stopped and turned back. He was watching her not performing, watching her not doing anything except being exactly who he was, steadily and without production. "Luca," she said. "Yes." "Thank you." She held his gaze. Not for fixing it, Because you didn't fix it. I'm fixing it. She paused. But for making it possible for me to fix it. That's different. And I want you to know that I know the difference. He looked at her across the kitchen, across this ordinary walnut and winter light kitchen that had become the geography of something she hadn't expected to ever live inside again. I know you know, he said. She went upstairs. She slept for 7 hours without interruption, which was the longest she had slept in 4 years, and in the morning she called her father and said in a voice she had never used with him before, I need to see you, and we need to talk about something real, and I'm not going to make it easy for you this time. He agreed to meet her. She hung up and sat on the edge of her bed in the morning light and felt the particular sensation of someone standing at the edge of the last door, the one she had been circling for 10 years, the one behind which something necessary and painful and long overdue was waiting. She stood up. She got dressed. She went to have the conversation that would change everything. Her father was already there when she arrived. Victor Vale sat at a corner table in the restaurant he had chosen. His territory, his choice, his instinct to control the geography of difficult conversations, exactly the same as it had always been. He was 63 years old, and he looked it in ways he hadn't 2 years ago. The weight of something unresolved had a way of aging a person, and Victor Vale had been carrying the weight of what he'd chosen not to see for a very long time. He stood when she came in. Old-fashioned courtesy, genuine in the way his courtesies always were. Victor Vale had never been a cruel man, which was the thing that made what he'd done so difficult to hold. Cruelty was simple. Weakness was complicated. She had spent years being furious at him for something that had no clean shape. Adriana. He kissed her cheek. She accepted it. They sat. He ordered coffee. She ordered water and kept her hands flat on the table and looked at her father and thought, this is the last time I do this with armor on. The last time I sit across from him and manage what I say to make it easier for him to receive. You look well, he said. I'm not here to talk about how I look, she said. He stilled. I'm going to say some things, she said, and I need you to listen without interrupting. Not because I'm being unkind, but because every time I've tried to have this conversation in the past, you've interrupted at exactly the moment when it became uncomfortable, and the interruption has always been a way of not hearing what I was saying. She looked at him steadily. I'm not giving you that option today. Victor Vale looked at his daughter, and she watched something move across his face. Not anger, something more complicated. The expression of a man who had been waiting for something and was not, now that it had arrived, entirely surprised. All right, he said. She told him. Not all of it. She had told all of it to Marcus and to Luca, and in different forms to Dana and to Claire, and each telling had taken something from her and given something back, and she knew now how to calibrate what needed to be said to whom. To her father, she told the truth of his specific failure. Not Sebastian's crimes, her father knew the shape of. Those had always known the shape had made a choice about the shape. She told him what it had cost her that he had made that choice. She told him about being 17 and watching him look at her with an expression she now understood was not disbelief, but the more painful thing belief followed immediately by the decision not to act on it. She told him about the years after. About what it felt like to sit across from Sebastian at Vale family dinners and perform normalcy while her father sat at the same table and poured the wine and talked about business. About what it had required of her to love him, her father, while also understanding that his love for her had a condition attached to it she'd never been told about explicitly, which was that the condition of his love was her silence. She talked for 22 minutes without stopping. Victor Vale did not interrupt. When she finished, the restaurant moved around them. Other conversations, other tables. The ordinary noise of people having ordinary lunches, and her father sat with his coffee cup in both hands and looked at the table, and she watched him process something she had waited 17 years for him to process. I knew, he said finally, 2 words. She had expected denial. She had prepared for denial, had built her arguments against the versions of not quite admission he'd always offered before the I didn't fully understand, and the Sebastian assured me, and the you seemed fine. She had not prepared for this. I knew it wasn't what he said it was, her father said. His voice was low and controlled in the way of someone controlling something that very much wants to come apart. I told myself I didn't know. I got very good at telling myself that. He looked up at her. That's not the same as not knowing. Adriana sat very still. Why? She said. Just the one word because it was the only word she actually needed answered. He was quiet for a long moment. Because knowing meant acting, he said. And acting meant Sebastian had. There were things he had about the business. About decisions I made in 2007 and 2008 when the company was in trouble. Things that would have... He stopped. I told myself I was protecting the family, the business, the people who worked for us. He looked at her. I was protecting myself. She had known this. She had worked it out over years in the small hours, in the careful logic of someone trying to understand a thing that resisted understanding. She had known it, and still hearing him say it, felt it land differently than she'd expected. Not as relief. Not as vindication. As grief. She grieved for 15 minutes silently over a water glass in a restaurant in Chicago. Then she said, I need you to do something. He looked at her. Marcus Webb is going to contact you, she said. He's going to ask you about some of what you just told me, about what you knew and when. I need you to answer him honestly. Her father's jaw tightened. Adriana, there are legal implications. I know there are, she said. I'm not asking you to do something that has no cost. I'm asking you to choose for the first time the right thing over the easy thing. She held his gaze. Sebastian filed a motion calling me mentally unstable. He's been building a record that says everything I say about him is the product of a disturbed mind. Your account, what you just told me, is the account of someone who was there. Who knew the man knew the situation knew me. She paused. Your voice is the one he can't explain away. Victor looked at her for a long moment. He was 63 years old, and he looked it, and he looked something else too. Something she hadn't seen on him before. The expression of a man who has arrived much too late at a decision he should have made long ago and knows it and is going to make it anyway. I'll talk to your attorney, he said. She breathed. Thank you, she said. She meant it, and she also meant the other thing, the thing underneath thank you, which was that this didn't fix it. That 17 years of a specific kind of abandonment didn't dissolve in a restaurant on a Wednesday. That she loved him and was furious with him and would spend a long time in that complicated weather, and that all of it was true simultaneously. She didn't say all of that. She said thank you, and she meant it in all the ways it contained. Marcus called her 2 hours later. Your father called me, he said. She almost missed a step on the sidewalk. Already, 40 minutes after you left lunch. A pause. He was thorough, Adriana. He volunteered more than I expected. The 2007 business arrangement. The specific conversation he had with Sebastian in 2012 when you were 19. Another pause. He told me about a conversation that happened in 2017 where Sebastian explicitly discussed his language was managing Adriana's behavior. Your father said he understood at the time what that meant and chose to interpret it as something else. She stopped walking entirely. Carmen stopped beside her. That's... She found her voice. That's on record now. It will be, yes. Marcus's voice was careful and warm in the way it sometimes was when something significant had shifted. This changes the shape of what we can build. It means Sebastian's version, that you are an unreliable narrator with a history of misinterpreting situations, now has to contend with a corroborating account from someone who has no strategic reason to give one. A pause. Your father is not helping you because it helps him. If anything, it creates exposure for him. Judges understand that. She started walking again. What happens now? She said. Now we file our response to his motion, Marcus said. And we file it with your father's account attached. And then we wait for Sebastian Crow to understand what he's dealing with. She was in the car heading home when her phone rang with Sebastian's number. She answered it. She was done not answering it, done managing the calculus of which calls to take and which to avoid. She answered it because she wanted to hear his voice, now that the geometry had changed, wanted to hear how he spoke when he didn't yet know how much had shifted. "I understand you had lunch with your father today," he said, warm, steady, the impeccable warmth. "He called me afterward." She hadn't expected that. "What did he say?" "He said he was going to speak with your attorney." A beat. That surprised me. Victor has always been practical. The warmth had something underneath it now that she recognized as a recalibration happening in real time. "I wonder what you said to him." "I told him the truth," she said. "Something I should have been able to do when I was 17. Silence. Not the comfortable silence of a man in control of a conversation. A different kind. "Adriana." His voice had changed register, still controlled, but the warmth had thinned in a way that told her the warmth was work, and the work was getting harder. "You need to think carefully about what you're doing." "I've been thinking carefully for 10 years, she said. "I'm done thinking carefully. I'm acting. The things I have, use them," she said. Another silence. Longer. "I beg your pardon." "Use them," she said again, and her voice was steady in a way that came from somewhere she hadn't known she had. "Whatever you have, the hospitalization, the 2019 incident, the therapy records you accessed without my consent. Use all of it." She paused. "Because every single piece of it tells the story of a woman surviving something, and I have a very good attorney who knows how to make sure that's the story people hear." The line was quiet for a full 5 seconds. "You've changed," Sebastian said. "Yes," she said. "I have. This won't end the way you think it will." "You don't know how I think it will end," she said. "You never did. You knew how to make me afraid and you mistook that for knowing me." She held the phone steady. "You don't know me, Sebastian. You never did." She ended the call. Carmen in the front seat said nothing, but her hands on the wheel shifted slightly, and in the rear-view mirror, something moved in her expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. Adriana sat back and looked out the window and felt the particular sensation of a door closing. Not dramatically, not with a slam, just quietly, firmly. Finally, the sound of something that had been held open for 10 years by fear, finally allowed to shut. Dana Kearse's story published on a Saturday morning 6 weeks after the Fitzgerald fundraiser. Adriana knew it was coming. Marcus had been in contact with Dana's editor for 2 weeks, not to influence the content, but to ensure the legal landscape was understood before publication. She had read the final draft 3 days before it ran, sitting at Marcus's conference table with Claire beside her. Claire, who had agreed to be named, who had made that decision in Marcus's office on a Thursday afternoon, with her hands folded on the table and her voice steady, and her eyes clear in the way of someone who has finally put down something very heavy. The story named Sebastian Crow. It named him with documentation, financial records, the pattern of legal filings, the corroborated timeline, her father's account paraphrased in language that protected what needed protecting legally while making the meaning absolutely clear. It named him with 2 named sources, Adriana and Claire, and 3 unnamed sources whose descriptions of their experiences formed a pattern that was Dana had written too specific and too consistent to be coincidence or misinterpretation. It was not a comfortable story to read. She read it anyway at 6 in the morning on a Saturday at the kitchen table with Luca across from her. Both of them quiet, the city still mostly dark outside. She read her own story in print for the first time. Not the version Sebastian had always wanted. Not the troubled young woman version. Not the misunderstand situations version, her actual story in her own words, and in the words of someone who had spent 6 weeks verifying them. She set her phone face down when she finished. "How does it feel?" Luca said. She thought about this honestly. "Like being seen," she said. "And like that's terrifying, even when you want it." She looked at him. "Is that strange?" "No," he said. That's exactly what it feels like. By 9 that morning, Dana's story had been shared 40,000 times. By noon, Sebastian Crow's attorney had issued a statement calling it reckless and defamatory and announcing that legal action would be pursued. By 2 in the afternoon, a third woman had contacted Dana Kearse's editor. Adriana heard this from Marcus, who called her while she was sitting in her sitting room with her phone in her hand, watching the notifications accumulate on the published article. She had turned her social media notifications off on the advice of Marcus and Elena and Carmen and Luca, all of whom had delivered this advice independently within the same 2-hour window. She'd complied, but she kept a second tab open. A third woman, she said. Her name is Patricia Donnell. She has a documented history with Crow from 14 years ago. Marcus paused. She's been watching the situation develop. She called Dana's editor an hour after the story published. Adriana pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment. He did this to her 14 years ago, she said. Yes. And she's been living with it alone for 14 years. She's been managing, Marcus said in the careful language he used when describing things that deserved more than careful language. The way people manage when there's nowhere safe to put something. She sat with that. Tell Dana, she said. Whatever Patricia needs, tell Dana to give her time and space and no pressure. I already did. And Marcus? She stopped. Yes. Thank you, she said. For all of it. For seeing it the right way from the beginning. For not... She stopped again because the thing she was trying to say was complicated, and she wasn't sure she had the language for it yet. For treating me like someone whose account was worth building something on. Marcus was quiet for a moment. That's just accuracy, he said. Your account was always worth building something on. The problem was never the account. She hung up and sat in the quiet of her room and thought about Patricia Donnell, who had been carrying something alone for 14 years and had seen a story published on a Saturday morning and reached for a phone. She thought about Claire, who had said, I'm doing it for me, and had meant it. She thought about the woman at the Fitzgerald fundraiser who had held her hand a beat too long and looked at her with that specific expression. She thought about a reporter who had taken a business card from a stranger at a party and made different choices because of it. She thought about what it meant that none of this would have happened if she had stayed in the version of her life that Sebastian Crow had designed for her. And then she stopped thinking and went downstairs. Luca was in the study. She found him there the way she'd been finding him in various rooms of this house for 6 weeks, reading, working, existing in the ordinary way of a person who occupied a space fully without filling it oppressively. She had noticed this about him from early on. He took up exactly the room he needed, and no more, which was a quality she associated with people who were genuinely secure and didn't require space as performance. She came in and sat across from him, and he looked up from what he was reading and waited. I want to tell you something, she said. Tell me. When this is finished, when the legal process runs its course, and the story has been told, and Sebastian Crow has run out of moves. She paused. I'm going to do something with it. Not just survive it, do something with it. He looked at her steadily. There are women who can't do what I did, she said, who don't have a Marcus Webb or a Luca Moretti, or the particular luck of a marriage that turned into something other than what it was supposed to be. She met his eyes. I want to build something. An organization. Something that provides what I didn't have: legal support, safe housing if needed, the specific kind of help that allows a woman to get far enough out of the situation to be able to speak. She paused. I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks. I wanted to see if it still made sense after the story published. And does it? More than it did before, she said. Because now, there's Patricia Donnell, who has been alone for 14 years. And whoever comes after Patricia, and whatever name we haven't heard yet from before 18 years ago. Her voice was steady. This doesn't end with Sebastian's case. It doesn't end with me. Luca was quiet for a long moment. What do you need to start? He said. She had anticipated several responses. She had not anticipated this one, not the directness of it, not the immediate movement from concept to practical question. She should have by now. She had been surprised by him regularly for 6 weeks, and she should have learned. "I have some ideas," she said. "But I need help building the legal structure, a non-profit, proper governance." She looked at him. "And I need it to be mine, not something connected to you in a way that makes people question the independence of it." He nodded slowly. "I can put you in contact with people who set up these structures without my name attached. It'll be clean." He paused. "And I'll stay out of the governance entirely. You have final say on everything." "I know that's how it would work," she said. "I'm telling you as—" She paused. "I'm telling you because I want to, not because I need permission, because this is something I'm choosing to share with you." Something in his expression changed. She had been learning his expressions for 6 weeks, learning the vocabulary of a face that communicated in careful, precise movements rather than broad ones. This one she had seen before only once, on the first night in the study, when she'd told him the word yes. The expression that meant something had arrived that he hadn't been certain was coming. "I know the difference," he said quietly. "I know you do." She looked at him across the room. This man who had been her unknown quantity, her arranged marriage transaction, her understood danger, and felt the truth of the past 6 weeks settle into something she could finally hold still and examine. He had never tried to own her recovery. He had never made her gratitude a currency. He had never. And this was the thing she kept returning to, the thing that distinguished him from every powerful person she had known. He had never made her feel that his help came with a price she'd have to pay, later in some form she hadn't agreed to. He had simply opened a door and stood beside it and let her walk through at her own speed. She had no roadmap for what to do with a person like that. She was building one day by day in the small and ordinary moments of a house that was becoming incrementally and improbably, and with a great deal of still unresolved complication, home. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask." That first night, she held his gaze. "When I said, 'Please don't touch me,' you stopped." "Yes." "Men don't usually stop," she said. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact. The flattest and most specific fact of her experience. "I know," he said. "Why did you?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of avoidance, she knew what that looked like. The quiet of someone finding the honest version of an answer. "Because you said please," he said. "Not stop, please." And please meant you were asking, which meant you'd been in situations where asking hadn't worked. He held her gaze. "I have never in my life wanted anything badly enough to take it from someone who was asking me not to." A pause. "And I was not going to start in a room where my wife was afraid of me on the first night of our marriage." She sat with that, with the simplicity of it, with the fact that what he had described was not extraordinary generosity or unusual virtue, it was the floor, the absolute minimum of human decency. And it had felt in that moment, and in the many moments since, like something rare beyond measuring, which told you everything about the landscape she had been living in. "You're a good man," she said. I know your reputation would find that. I'm a complicated man," he said, "with a complicated life and a set of choices I've made that don't all survive scrutiny." He held her gaze. "I'm not a good man in general. But I'm trying to be a good man in this room, in this house with you. Those are not the same thing." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to be otherwise." She paused. "I'm just telling you what I see." He looked at her, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, which was still not very unguarded, because this was Luca Moretti, who had built his entire existence on the strategic deployment of what he revealed. But there was something in it, something present and human and slightly afraid, which she hadn't expected. He was afraid too. Of this. Of whatever this was becoming. Of the unfamiliar territory of someone seeing him clearly and staying anyway. She recognized the fear because she lived in it. "We're both figuring this out," she said. "Yes," he said, "we are." Toy. Sebastian Crow's legal team withdrew the psychological evaluation motion 17 days after Dana's story published. They did this quietly through a procedural filing that contained no admission of anything, which was exactly what his attorneys had been paid to produce. But the motion was withdrawn. The record that he had been attempting to build the preemptive architecture of her unreliability came down. Adriana heard about it from Marcus at 8 in the morning and sat at the kitchen table and held the phone for a long moment after she'd ended the call and felt not triumph. She had expected triumph, and what arrived instead was something quieter and more complicated. The specific exhaustion of a war that has been running beneath the surface of ordinary life for a long time, and the strange disorientation of a morning without it. Elena came in with coffee and set it down without comment. Carmen appeared in the doorway, read the room, and retreated. Luca came downstairs at 8:15 and looked at her face and said, "The motion." He withdrew it. Luca sat down across from her. He didn't say anything. He didn't produce a reaction sized to the occasion. He just sat there and drank his coffee and was present in the specific way she had come to understand was his version of solidarity. After a while she said, "It's not over." "No," he agreed. "The criminal investigation is still, Marcus says it moves slowly. And the civil case, if Claire decides to move forward with one that's..." She looked at her coffee. "This is one piece. It's a significant piece. I know." She looked up. "I'm not minimizing it. I've been living in this for 10 years, and I know that men like Sebastian don't collapse in one motion withdrawal. He's still there. He still has his relationships and his reputation, and his version of events that some people will always prefer." She paused. "But the comfortable explanation is getting less comfortable." Luca looked at her steadily. "3 months ago," he said, "you were in a house with a man who had been controlling your life for a decade, and your father had chosen him over you, and you had a notebook full of things you'd never been able to use, and you were walking into a marriage to a stranger you were afraid of." He held her gaze. "And now?" She thought about now, about a legal record that told a different story than the one Sebastian had been building, about Claire, who had named herself, who had met with Marcus twice more since that first Thursday, and each time seemed to take up slightly more space in the room. About Patricia Donnell, who was still deciding but was talking. About a reporter who had spent 6 weeks building something airtight, and then published it and watched it travel 40,000 shares in one morning. About her father who had called her twice since their lunch, not with agenda, just to talk, which was something he had not done in her adult life, and which she was approaching with appropriate caution, and also with the specific grief of someone who has wanted something for a long time, and is learning what it actually looks like when it arrives. About a house that had a kitchen table where important things happened. About a man across that table who had stopped when she said, "Please." "Now," she said. She let the word stand alone for a moment. Then, "Now I'm building something." The organization opened its doors on a Thursday in March, 7 months after the wedding that had not been about love, and had improbably, and without anyone's design, grown into something that complicated that original description entirely. She called it the Clear Door Foundation, because that was what she'd needed, and hadn't had not a rescue, not a dramatic intervention, just a door that was clearly marked and actually opened and led somewhere real. The launch was not a gala. She had been deliberate about this. No fundraiser, no black tie event, no performance of philanthropy in a room full of people who were there to be seen being charitable. The opening was a Thursday afternoon, in an office space in Wicker Park, with a staff of 6, and a resource library, and a legal assistance program, and a confidential intake line that had been staffed since 7 that morning. By noon, the line had received 11 calls. She stood in the office with her phone in her hand, looking at the number 11, and felt something move through her chest that was too large for the space it was moving through. Claire was there. Claire had joined the board, a decision she'd made in January, quietly over coffee with Adriana in the same Wicker Park shop where they'd had their first meeting, folding her hands around a cup and saying, "I want to help build it. with the specific confidence of someone who has decided to stop managing a situation and start changing it. Elena had taken the morning off and appeared with food because Elena's response to every significant occasion was food, which was one of Elena's many excellent qualities. Carmen was there off-duty in the way that was never entirely off-duty. Marcus was there looking at the intake log with the expression of someone watching something he helped construct begin to work. Luca was not there. This had been her decision, and his understanding of it, that the foundation needed to be entirely hers, needed to exist without any shadow of his name or his network or the complicated associations that came with both. He had helped her set up the legal structure through 3 layers of removal from himself. He had reviewed the governance documents once at her request and made 2 suggestions and then stepped entirely back. He had sent flowers. They were on the reception desk. White peonies, which she recognized, which made her press her mouth together for a moment before she got it under control. At 4 in the afternoon, when the staff was settling into the ordinary rhythms of a first operational day, she stepped outside and called him. He picked up on the first ring. "How is it?" he said. 11 calls by noon, she said. The intake coordinator said 3 of them had never told anyone before, any part of it. Called us first. She paused. 3 women who had been carrying something alone and found a number to call. He was quiet for a moment. "The peonies," she said. "You had them at the wedding." "I know." She looked at the street, the ordinary Chicago street with its ordinary winter traffic. "I remember thinking they were the only beautiful thing I actually got to choose that day." He was quiet for a moment. "You get to choose a great deal more now," he said. "Yes," she said. "I do." She let the truth of that sit in the air between them across whatever distance separated where she was standing from where he was. "I'll be home by 7. "I'll be there," he said. She put the phone in her pocket and stood on the sidewalk in the March cold and looked at the door of the office. The actual door with the foundation's name etched into the glass, which she had chosen, because clear, because marked, because opens when you push it, and felt the specific weight of a life that has survived something and has chosen not to stop there. Not because the surviving was finished. Sebastian Crow's legal situation was still unresolved and would be for months, possibly years. The criminal investigation moved at the pace of criminal investigations, which was slow and non-linear and required a tolerance for uncertainty that she was still developing. There would be more moves from his side, more recalibrations, more moments that required her to stand in rooms and not look away first. She knew all of this. She stood on the sidewalk knowing it, and felt it at its full weight, and stayed standing anyway. Inside, the phone was ringing, the 12th call. She went back inside to make sure it was answered. That evening, she sat across from Luca at the kitchen table and told him about the 12 calls, and about the woman who had cried for 4 minutes before she could speak, and about Claire's face when the intake coordinator had walked over and said quietly that they'd had to extend coverage because the volume was higher than projected. Luca listened. When she was done, he said, "Are you okay?" She thought about the question, gave it the full consideration it deserved, because she was trying to be someone who answered this question honestly rather than reflexively. "I'm tired," she said. "And I'm sad for the 12 women who needed to call today. And I'm—" She found the word carefully. "Glad." Which feels like the wrong word for something this serious, but it's accurate. Glad that the door existed. Glad that the phone was answered. "That's not the wrong word," he said. She looked at him across the table. This table. This kitchen. This man who had been a stranger, and was now she still didn't have a word for what he was now. And she had stopped looking for one, because the thing between them was still growing into its shape, and naming it prematurely would have been dishonest. What she knew was this: she had walked into a marriage afraid of him, and had discovered over 7 months of ordinary and extraordinary days that the most dangerous thing about Luca Moretti was that he had made her believe slowly, and without theater, and without ever demanding she hurry up about it, that safety was something she was allowed to have. That had been the most frightening thing he had done to her, and also the most important. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "The night I arrived here, the first night." She held his gaze. "You said in this house no one will hurt you. You said it and I didn't believe it." "I know." "I believe it now," she said. He looked at her, and she let him look, didn't manage the exposure of it, just looked back. "I know that too," he said quietly. She reached across the kitchen table, across the distance between them, across the 6 months of careful mornings and significant conversations, and the slow, deliberate building of something that had started as nothing and had refused to stay that way, and she set her hand on top of his. He turned his hand over and held hers. Just that. No performance, no production. Just 2 hands on a kitchen table at the end of a Thursday in March, in a city where a woman who had once whispered, "Please don't touch me," had spent 7 months learning what it felt like when touch was a choice and not a threat. She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside Chicago carried on the enormous, indifferent, occasionally brutal city that contained within it on this evening a foundation with 12 calls logged on its first day, and a woman who had found her voice, and a man who had understood from the very first night that the bravest thing he could do was wait. Adriana Vale had arrived at this table afraid, and she was leaving it tonight and every night going forward as herself. That was the whole story, and it was enough, and it was entirely hers.